Every person who has ever sat in a church, a mosque, a synagogue, or a philosophy class has been handed the same story about reality. God made the world. The world is good. You are here to obey, to believe, and to wait. That is the official version. That is the one that got the funding, the armies, the printing presses, and 2,000 years of institutional enforcement. But there is another story, older, stranger, more unsettling. A story about where this world actually came from, what you actually are underneath the conditioning, and why that feeling, the one you have carried your entire life, that something about this reality is fundamentally, structurally wrong, is not anxiety. It is not pathology. It is a memory. This is the last video you will ever need about Gnosticism. Not because it covers everything, but because by the end, you will understand the system completely. Let's start with the word itself, because the word has been destroyed by bad usage. Gnosticism. Most people who have heard it associate it with one of three things: a vague New Age spirituality involving crystals and self-discovery, a heresy label attached to fringe Christian sects the church disagreed with, or an academic term that belongs in a theology dissertation no one reads. None of those are it. The word comes from the Greek gnosis, which means knowledge, not belief, not faith, not doctrine, knowledge, direct, experiential, first-person knowledge of ultimate reality. The distinction matters more than almost anything else in this entire video, so let's be precise about it. Faith, in the religious sense, means assenting to a claim you cannot verify. You believe Jesus rose from the dead. You believe Muhammad received divine revelation. You believe the Torah is the word of God. These are faith propositions. You are asked to hold them as true without direct access to the events themselves. This is not a criticism. It is simply a description of how exoteric religion for the general public, operates. Gnosis is different. Gnosis is the direct apprehension of what you are and where you come from. Not as a belief you hold, as an experience you have. The Gnostics were not people who believed a different set of propositions than the Orthodox Christians. They were people who claimed that the entire proposition-holding framework was the wrong tool for the job. You do not need to believe in the divine. You need to wake up to what you already are. This distinction drove the institutional church absolutely insane. Because if you can access truth directly, you do not need a priest. You do not need a hierarchy. You do not need an institution standing between you and God. You are your own point of access. The church understood exactly what this meant for its power, which is why, beginning in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, Gnostic teachers were denounced, Gnostic texts were ordered destroyed, and possession of Gnostic writings eventually became a capital offense in the Roman Empire. They did not try to out-argue the Gnostics, they tried to erase them. Now, here is something important to establish before we go any further. Gnosticism is not a single unified religion with a fixed creed. It is a family of related movements, some Jewish, some Christian, some drawing on Platonic philosophy, some synthesizing all three that share a cluster of core ideas. Different schools, different teachers, different texts, but the same fundamental map of reality underneath all of them. Over the course of this video, we will cover that map in full. We will name the specific schools, the specific teachers, the specific texts. But the map itself, the architecture, is what matters. Because once you understand the architecture, every Gnostic text you ever encounter will immediately make sense. You will be able to read any of them and orient yourself instantly. The core architecture is this. Reality has two levels. There is the level of the true divine infinite, perfect, beyond description, beyond personality, beyond anything we would normally call God. And then there is this world, this physical, limited, suffering-saturated, death-soaked world. And the claim of Gnosticism, the claim that is documented in text after text discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, in the Coptic scrolls, in the writings of the Sethian and Valentinian schools, is that those two levels are not continuous. This world was not made by the true God. This world was made by a lesser being, a being who was either ignorant or deluded, or actively malevolent, a being who declared himself God and had no idea that above him, infinite and untouched, the real divine was watching. That is the architecture. That is what the Gnostics discovered, or remembered, or were taught. And when you understand it, really understand it, not as an interesting philosophical position, but as a complete description of lived experience, the feeling you have carried your entire life finally has a name. We are going to build that understanding from the ground up. starting with what exists before everything else, before this world, before the being who made this world, before any of the events that produced the reality you were born into, before the material world existed, before the stars were constructed, before the first atom cohered out of whatever preceded physics. Before the being who calls himself God spoke a single word into the darkness he himself created, there was the pleroma. That is where this story begins. Pleroma is a Greek word. It means fullness, completeness, the state of nothing being missing, nothing being absent, nothing being elsewhere, not a place you travel to, not a realm above the clouds in the geographic sense. The pleroma, as the Sethian texts describe it as documents like the Apocryphon of John, a text scholars date to approximately the 2nd century CE and discovered in 1945 near Nag Hammadi, Egypt, describe it as the nature of ultimate reality before any differentiation occurred, before there was a here and a there, before there was a now and a then, pure, unbounded, self-complete being that does not require anything outside itself, because outside itself, by definition, nothing exists. At the center of the pleroma is what the Gnostic texts call the monad, or the one, or the invisible spirit. The name changes across different schools and different texts, but the referent is identical. The source, the absolute ground of being from which everything that follows will eventually emerge, and the Gnostic descriptions of the monad are some of the most philosophically precise documents in the ancient world, not despite the fact that they're religious texts. Because of it, the Apocryphon of John, speaking of the monad, says this, and I am rendering the meaning directly from the Coptic. It is not a god, and it is not like a god. It cannot be measured. It cannot be limited. It cannot be compared to anything. It does not exist in time. It did not come into being. It will not cease being. It contains all things, and is contained by nothing. It is not good in the way that a generous person is good. It is the source from which goodness itself becomes possible. This is not poetry. This is not metaphor. The Gnostic authors are making a precise philosophical claim. The ultimate ground of reality is categorically beyond any attribute you could name. If you call it good, you have limited it, because goodness implies a contrast with something that is not good. If you call it powerful, you have limited it, because power implies something that could resist that power. The monad is prior to every category, including the category of being itself. The Valentinian school, the movement founded by Valentinus, who taught in Rome around 140 CE, and was arguably the most sophisticated theological thinker of his era, described the monad using the term baithos, the deep. Imagine the deepest possible depth beneath any thought you could form about what exists. That depth is where the monad is, not above you, beneath every concept you have about what is real. Now, here is where the pleroma becomes more than a single point. The monad, in its absolute self-completeness, does not create the way a craftsman creates. A craftsman takes material that already exists and shapes it into something new. The monad has no external material. 528. There is nothing outside it. So, when the pleroma differentiates, when it becomes more than one, it does so through emanation. Emanation is one of the most important concepts in all of Gnostic thought, and it is almost always misunderstood. Think of it this way. A candle does not diminish when it lights another candle. The flame passes without any loss to the original flame. The source is not reduced by what it generates. The monad emanates, pours itself outward, expresses itself into differentiated forms without ever becoming less. The pleroma fills with what the Gnostic texts call aeons, divine emanations. Beings of pure light and consciousness that are not separate from the monad, the way you are separate from the person next to you. They are expressions of it, facets. The way a single beam of white light contains all colors without being divided. The Valentinian system, documented in texts like the Gospel of Truth, which scholars date to around 150 CE, and which Valentinus himself may have authored, describes the aeons as paired emanations. Mind and truth, word and life, human being and church. Each pair a further unfolding of the monad's own infinite nature. Not a family tree, a flowering, a single source becoming ever more richly differentiated without ever leaving itself. This is the world that existed before your world, perfect, complete, without lack, without suffering, without the particular darkness that you know as ordinary experience. No separation, no scarcity, no death, no time passing and taking things away, no bodies that decay and make you afraid. The pleroma is fullness, and everything within it is fullness, and there is no place in the fullness for anything that is not full. And then something happened. One of the aeons, the last of them, the youngest, the one furthest from the monad in the order of emanation, made a move that no aeon had ever made before, a move that the pleroma was not built to accommodate. And in that single event, in that one moment of divine disruption, the entire chain of events that produced this world, this life, and your particular suffering was set into motion. That aeon's name was Sophia, and her story is where everything begins to break apart. Sophia is not a minor figure in Gnostic cosmology. She is arguably the most important figure in it, more important than the demiurge who built this world, more important than the archons who maintain it, because she is the hinge. She is the point at which the story turns from perfect and complete into broken and searching. Everything that follows every element of the reality you inhabit can be traced back to what Sophia did. In the Apocryphon of John, which is one of the earliest and most complete Sethian cosmological texts we possess, Sophia is described as the final aeon in the pleroma's structure, the furthest expression of the monad, and she did something that violated the fundamental principle of how the pleroma works. She acted alone. Here is why that matters. In the pleroma, emanation happens in consent with the whole. Each aeon emerges as part of the complete self-expression of the monad. Nothing acts outside the total harmony of fullness. But Sophia, moved by what the text describes as a desire, a will, a longing, attempted to know the monad directly, to comprehend it herself, without going through the paired harmony that the pleroma's structure requires. She wanted to grasp the source in a way that was unprecedented. And in that wanting, in that reaching, something went wrong. The Gnostic texts are precise about what went wrong. Sophia's desire was not evil, it was not malicious. In some versions of the story, it was the most understandable thing imaginable, a love so intense for the source that it exceeded what the structure could hold. But the result was a catastrophe, regardless of the intention. What emerged from Sophia's unauthorized act was not a divine aeon. It was something defective, something that should not exist. A being born without the monad's blessing, without the full divine inheritance, without the light that all legitimate aeons carry. That being was the demiurge. Sophia, horrified by what she had produced, hid it from the rest of the pleroma. She wrapped her mistake in matter, or what would become matter, and cast it below the pleroma into a region of darkness and absence, a region that was not the fullness, a region defined by its lack. But she also passed into her creation something she could not withhold. Because she is an aeon, because she is made of divine light, a portion of that divine light went with the demiurge into the darkness, not intentionally. The way a mother passes genetic material to a child she never intended to conceive, it went because it could not go. It is part of what Sophia is. And that fragment of Sophia's divine light, hidden deep inside the flawed creation the demiurge would construct, is what the Gnostic texts will later call the divine spark, the pneuma, the thing inside you that is not from here. We have covered this story in significant depth in a recent video on this channel, the full story of Gnostic Sophia, and a viewer responded to that video with something that stopped me completely. They wrote, simply, "I understood it." 2 words. Because sometimes that is exactly what happens when you encounter a map that finally matches the territory of your experience. You do not need to respond with more words. You just recognize it. Now back to the demiurge. Because this being is the architect of everything you know as physical reality, and understanding him is essential to understanding everything else in this video, the Apocryphon of John names him Yaldabaoth, the hypostasis of the archons. Another Nag Hammadi text calls him Samael, which in Hebrew means the blind god. The Gospel of Judas, a text that caused enormous controversy when it was fully translated and published in 2006, describes him with barely concealed contempt. Across every Gnostic school, across every variant tradition, the demiurge carries the same fundamental characteristic. He is ignorant of what is above him. He looks around at the darkness he inhabits. He has Sophia's stolen light inside him, giving him creative power. And he builds. He builds a world. He organizes matter and energy and structure and time. He creates a cosmos that has order and logic and law. And then he makes a declaration. The Apocryphon of John records the exact words, and they are among the most extraordinary sentences in all of ancient literature. The demiurge looks at his creation and says, "I am God, and there is no other God beside me." The Gnostic texts note, with a kind of cold precision, that this statement is factually incorrect, not philosophically debatable, factually incorrect. Above him, untouched and infinite, is the entire pleroma, the monad. The fullness of being that he did not create and cannot comprehend. He is not God. He is a craftsman who mistook his workshop for the entire universe. And in that ignorance, in that profound structural blindness, he made this world. The world you are living in right now, with its beauty and its horror, its order and its cruelty, its occasional glimpses of something transcendent, and its constant grinding return to limitation, suffering, and death. The Gnostic answer to the oldest question in philosophy, why does a good God allow suffering, is not a theodicy. It is not a rationalization. It is a correction. The being who made this world is not good. He is not evil either, he is blind. And a blind architect who declares himself God and builds a cosmos from ignorance will produce exactly the kind of world you see when you open your eyes in the morning. That is where you are. That is the structure of the place you were born into. Now we need to talk about what the demiurge did with the divine spark he unknowingly carried, and what it means for what you are. When Sophia fell, when her unilateral emanation collapsed into a flawed, broken thing, the substance of what she produced was not pure darkness. It was not simply error. It was divine light wrapped inside a mistake. The demiurge, that blind and arrogant craftsman, was born from Sophia's fall. And this is the part that almost no one talks about when they mention Gnosticism. He was born carrying something he had no framework to understand. He carried a fragment, a spark of pleroma consciousness inside his very substance. He did not know it was there. He could not see it. He could not feel it in the way something knowing would feel. He was blind, and the most precious thing in existence was embedded in him like a diamond sealed inside concrete. The Apocryphon of John makes this explicit. The text discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, dated by scholars to around 180 CE, describes the structure of the demiurge not as purely evil, but as incomplete, a being constituted from something divine but operating entirely without that divinity's awareness. He declares himself God. He declares there is no other God before him. And the text records, with a kind of quiet devastation, that this declaration is not malice, it is ignorance. He genuinely does not know what he is carrying. He genuinely does not know what exists above him. The trimorphic protanoia, another Nag Hammadi text, describes the divine light descending through the layers of the demiurge's construction without the archons, his lieutenants, the architects of the material prison recognizing it for what it is. The light passes through. It enters the material world. And this is the mechanism that the Gnostic texts return to again and again, because it is the mechanism that explains you. When the demiurge fashioned the human being, and this account appears across multiple Gnostic schools, in the hypostasis of the archons, in the secret book of John, in the Gospel of Philip, he was following Sophia's blueprint. He was imitating. And in his imitation, something happened that he did not intend and could not control. The divine spark, the pneuma, the fragment of pleroma light that had filtered down through the fall, became embedded in the creature he created. He built a prison for the divine, without realizing the divine was now living inside it. Think about what this means structurally. The demiurge creates matter. He creates the body. He creates the psychic layer, what the Gnostics called the soul in its lower sense, the animating principle that keeps the body functioning. He controls all of that. He designed all of that. But he did not create the pneuma, the spirit, the divine fragment that now inhabits the creature he built. He is the architect of the house. He is not the architect of the resident. This distinction matters enormously. The body is material, and the material belongs to the demiurge's domain. The lower psyche, emotional life, appetites, the drive for survival, the social self belongs to the archon's realm of influence. But the pneuma, the deepest core of what a human being is, belongs to the pleroma. It always has. The demiurge's control stops precisely at the boundary of that innermost layer. He can confine it. He can bury it under matter and distraction and forgetting. But he cannot own it. He cannot destroy it. And he cannot prevent it from eventually recognizing what it is. This is why the Gnostic tradition treats human beings with an almost startling reverence that runs completely counter to the contempt of the demiurge. You are not primarily a body. You are not primarily a set of appetites and social roles and accumulated memories. You are a fragment of pleroma light that has been sealed inside a biological structure, inside a material prison, and you have been here so long, through so many lifetimes in the Gnostic understanding, that you have forgotten what you are. The word the Gnostics used for this forgetting was important. Not ignorance in the ordinary sense, not stupidity. Lethe, the forgetting that is structural, enforced, built into the very architecture of the material world you were born into. The cosmos itself is designed to make you forget. The body's needs are loud. The Archon's world is demanding. The noise is constant. And underneath all of it, quiet, patient, and essentially indestructible, is what you actually are. Now comes the question the texts are building toward. If the divine spark is there, if it has always been there, why doesn't everyone know it? Why doesn't every human being wake up automatically? This is where the Gnostics introduce the most controversial and arguably the most psychologically precise concept in their entire framework. The Gnostic anthropology, their map of what human beings are, is one of the most debated and most misunderstood elements of the entire tradition. When people first encounter it, the immediate reaction is often discomfort, because it divides humanity into categories. And in a culture that has spent several centuries insisting all human beings are fundamentally identical in nature, a framework that says otherwise feels dangerous. It feels like it's setting up a hierarchy. It feels like elitism. Hold that reaction. Look at what the texts actually say. Valentinus, the great Gnostic teacher who worked in Rome around 140 CE, developed the most systematic version of this anthropology. His school, Valentinianism, was one of the most sophisticated theological movements of the ancient world, and the church fathers who opposed him devoted enormous energy to refuting his ideas precisely because they were difficult to dismiss. Valentinus described three types of human constitution, not three types of person in a fixed, eternal, immovable sense. Three types of dominant orientation in how consciousness relates to its own deepest nature. The first type he called hylix, from the Greek word for matter hyle. These are people whose orientation is entirely toward the material, not because they are bad people, not because they are stupid or damned, but because their entire conscious life is organized around material reality as the only real thing. They pursue pleasure, avoid pain, accumulate security, navigate social status, and the deepest layer of their being, the pneuma, remains entirely dormant. Functionally, for them, it is as if it is not there. The Gnostic texts do not condemn the hylic. They describe a condition, not a crime. The second type was called psychics, from the Greek word for soul, psyche. This is the middle category, and it is where the texts place most of Orthodox Christianity, most of institutional religion, most of moral and ethical frameworks that acknowledge something beyond the purely material, but cannot penetrate all the way to the pneumatic core. Psychics feel the spiritual dimension. They respond to religious frameworks, to ethics, to the sense that there is something greater than the body. But they relate to that greater thing through belief, through faith, through moral performance, not through direct internal recognition. The demiurge is their god, not because he has deceived them maliciously, but because their consciousness has not yet opened to the layer that lies beyond his reach. The third type was the pneumatics, from pneuma spirit, the divine fragment. These are people in whom the divine spark has begun to stir, to press against the walls of the material and psychic layers, generating that precise feeling of alien displacement that the Gnostic texts describe with such accuracy. The sense that this world is wrong, the sense that you do not belong here, in some fundamental way that has nothing to do with social rejection or personal trauma. The sense that reality as presented is a diminished copy of something you can almost, but not quite remember. You know that feeling. If you are watching a video about Gnosticism at whatever hour you're watching this, in whatever state of mind brought you here, you know exactly what I'm describing. That is not pathology. That is not alienation in the clinical sense. According to the pneumatic anthropology of Valentinus, and the wider Gnostic tradition that is recognition, the pneuma pressing against the walls of forgetfulness, the divine fragment beginning to remember what it is. Now, and this is where the misreading always happens, the Gnostic texts do not present these three categories as fixed metaphysical castes. The Valentinian school was actually quite nuanced on this point. The categories describe tendencies, orientations, the current state of consciousness in relation to its own depth. They are not permanent assignments. A hylic orientation can shift. A psychic can penetrate deeper. The categories are diagnostic, not deterministic. What the texts do insist on, however, is this: gnosis, the direct, lived, interior recognition of the divine spark, cannot be produced through external means alone. It cannot be preached into someone. It cannot be ritualized into someone. It cannot be argued into someone. A psychic can receive the information and organize it into belief. Only a pneumatic, in the Gnostic framework, receives the information as recognition as the moment a hidden thing is finally named. This is also why the Gnostic communities were structured the way they were. Not hierarchical in the Roman Catholic sense, not a structure of institutional authority over lay people, but differentiated, different teachings for different levels of interior development. The outer circle received the mythological narratives. The inner circle received the direct transmission that the myths were pointing toward. 2 tracks, not because some people deserved truth and others didn't, but because the same truth lands differently depending on the depth from which it is received. The word gnosis has been used badly for a very long time. It gets imported into conversations about secret knowledge, about hidden wisdom traditions, about underground societies with coded handshakes and ancient manuscripts. All of that is a distortion. Not a complete fabrication. The Gnostics did have esoteric teachings. They did have inner circles. They did preserve texts they considered dangerous to leave in the open. But the word itself, at its core, is something far more precise and far more radical than any of those associations suggest. Gnosis is a Greek word. It means knowledge, but not knowledge in the sense of information, not knowledge in the sense of what you learn from reading a book or listening to a lecture. The Greeks had a different word for that episteme, systematic intellectual understanding. They also had doxa, opinion, belief. These are the kinds of knowing that operate through the mind's surface layers, through logic and language and argument. Gnosis is something else entirely. The closest modern approximation is what psychologists and contemplatives call direct knowing, the immediate, self-evident recognition of something that requires no external verification, because the thing known and the knower are not, in that moment, separate. You do not know fire by reading a description of combustion. You know fire by touching it. The knowing and the experience are the same event. Gnosis, for the Gnostic tradition, is that quality of knowing applied to the deepest question, what am I, at the level that exists prior to the body, prior to the personality, prior to the social self I have constructed over a lifetime inside this material prison. The Gospel of Truth, a Valentinian text, likely written by Valentinus himself, dated to around 150 CE, and found at Nag Hammadi, opens with one of the most precisely written sentences in all of ancient spiritual literature. It describes gnosis not as the acquisition of something new, but as the elimination of something that was obscuring what was always already there. Ignorance, agnosis, is not a vacuum. It is a positive condition, a kind of substance, a layer of fog that the divine spark is buried under. Gnosis is not filling an empty vessel. It is dissolving the fog. This distinction changes everything about how you understand the Gnostic project. The goal is not to learn more. The goal is to unlearn the layers of false identification that the material world and the archonic structures have spent your entire life depositing on top of what you are. The Gnostics called this process anamnesis, unforgetting, not learning, remembering. The prefix a negates the Greek word for forgetting, mnesis. Anamnesis is the reversal of the structural amnesia built into the material world. It is the divine spark recognizing itself through the noise of everything the demiurge built to prevent exactly that. Irenaeus of Lyon, the 2nd century bishop who wrote one of the most extensive early refutations of Gnosticism, understood this precisely enough to be terrified of it. In Against Heresies, written around 180 CE, he describes the Gnostic claim that inner recognition gnosis renders external religious authority unnecessary. You don't need the bishop. You don't need the sacraments. You don't need the institutional church as a mediating structure between you and the divine, because the divine is not above you or outside you or held in trust by an institution. The divine is you, at your deepest layer, waiting to be recognized. Irenaeus understood that this was not just a competing theology. It was the dissolution of the entire institutional basis of what was becoming the Roman Church. That is why the response was not debate. The response, once the Church had political power, was elimination. But here is what makes gnosis even more specific than a simple experience of unity or transcendence. The Gnostic texts are careful about this. Not every mystical experience is gnosis. Not every feeling of expanded consciousness. Not every moment of oceanic unity. Not every peak experience qualifies. Gnosis, in the technical sense of the Valentinian and Sethian traditions, carries specific content. It is not merely the feeling that everything is connected. It is the recognition of 3 specific things simultaneously: what you are, where you came from, and where you are going. These three questions, framed in exactly this way, appear across multiple Nag Hammadi texts as the definition of what Gnosis answers. Where did I come from? I came from the Pleroma. What am I? A fragment of divine light embedded in a material body inside a cosmos, built by a blind craftsman who does not know I am here. Where am I going? Back, not as the body, not as the personality. As the pneuma, the divine fragment returning to the fullness it was never supposed to leave in the first place. Those three questions, that specific content, that is the target. Everything else in the Gnostic system, the cosmology, the mythology, the ritual practices, the esoteric communities, is infrastructure built to make the arrival at those three answers possible. The demiurge did not work alone. This is one of the aspects of Gnostic cosmology that tends to generate the most resistance in modern readers, because it moves from a difficult but abstractly graspable claim, a blind creator god, into territory that sounds, on the surface, like ancient mythology in the less flattering sense. But stay with it, because the Archon framework, when you examine what the texts are actually describing, is one of the most psychologically acute models of human limitation ever constructed. The word Archon means ruler. In the political vocabulary of the ancient world, an Archon was a magistrate, an official, someone with administrative power over a defined domain. The Gnostic texts take this word and apply it to a class of beings that the demiurge generated again, without full understanding as he constructed the material cosmos. 7 archons are the most common number across texts, though some traditions describe more. Each archon rules a layer of the cosmos, what the texts call a heavenly sphere in the ancient cosmological sense, not in the modern astronomical sense. 7 spheres, 7 rulers, 7 layers of reality that a descending divine spark must pass through and that an ascending pneumatic consciousness must eventually pass back through. The Apocryphon of John names them. Yaldabaoth is the first the demiurge himself, or his chief lieutenant depending on the text. Below him, Harmas, associated with perception bound to material reality, Galila, Yobel, Adonaios, Sabaoth, whose figure is actually more complex than a simple archon in some texts, Astaphios, and others depending on which version you're reading. The specific names matter less than the function they represent. Each archon governs a mode of consciousness, a way of experiencing reality that locks a human being into a particular layer of the material cosmos. The hypostasis of the archons, the reality of the rulers, another Nag Hammadi text, describes the archons not as omnipotent controllers but as beings with specific jurisdictions and specific limitations. They are powerful within their domains. Outside their domains, they have no authority at all. This is a crucial distinction. The archonic forces are not infinite. They are structural. They govern the layers they were given to govern, and they cannot penetrate the pneumatic core of the human being any more than the demiurge can. But what do the archons actually do? What is their mode of operation in a human life? The Gnostic answer is more sophisticated than simple cosmic villainy. The archons operate through what the texts describe as the passions, not emotions in themselves, but emotional and psychological patterns that bind consciousness to the material layer. Fear of death, desire for material security, the need for social approval, the drive toward domination, the tendency to identify completely with the body and its status, its pleasure, its survival. These are archonic territories. Not because these experiences are evil in themselves, but because total identification with them makes the deeper layer of what you are functionally invisible. Read that again carefully. The archons do not destroy the divine spark. They cannot. What they do is maintain the conditions under which the divine spark remains buried under layer after layer of material anxiety, social performance, bodily identification, and the structural forgetfulness built into the architecture of the world itself. Their power is the power of distraction so complete and so constant that the thing being distracted from never gets a moment of silence in which it could be recognized. This is why the Gnostic practices, which we will reach in detail, are centered almost entirely on creating interior silence and directing attention inward, not as spiritual aesthetics. As a specific counter-operation against the archonic mechanism, if the archons work through noise, through constant material demand, through the endless press of bodily and social imperatives, then the act of going silent, of withdrawing attention from all of that, is not withdrawal from life. It is the removal of the interference pattern that prevents the signal from being heard. There is a passage in the Trotite Tractate, a Nag Hammadi text that likely dates to the 3rd century, that describes the archons as beings who are themselves unaware of the full scope of what they are participating in. They are, in their own way, also caught inside a system they did not fully design and do not fully understand. This is what the serious Gnostic interpreters mean when they resist reducing the Gnostic texts to simple dualism, good versus evil, light versus dark. The archons are not Satan and his demons in the Christian sense. They are structural forces operating according to their nature, which is limitation, which is the nature of everything that comes from a source that was itself limited. The entire cosmic structure, from the pleroma's edge to the material world you inhabit, is a cascade of diminishment. Not malicious diminishment, structural diminishment. Each level is a less complete expression of what came before it. The archons rule the levels they were generated to rule. And the human being, the pneumatic human being, carries something inside that came from before any of those levels existed. This is the basis of everything the Gnostic path is designed to do. So let's talk about what you are. Not who you are, what you are. Because the Gnostic texts make a very specific claim about human nature that is unlike anything in mainstream religious thought, and it is unlike anything in secular materialist philosophy either. It sits exactly in the space between those two frameworks, and it challenges both of them at the same root. The Gnostic anthropology, the Gnostic understanding of the human being, is built on a single foundational assertion: the human being is not one thing. The human being is three things, layered inside each other, and most people live their entire lives mistaking the outer layer for the whole. The texts describe three components. The first is the material body, called the hylic layer, from the Greek word for matter. This is the physical architecture: neurons, blood, bone, the part that was assembled from the material world and will return to the material world when it is finished. The archons understand this layer completely. They built its conditions. They control its environment. Every biological drive, every survival instinct, every hunger and fear that operates at the purely animal level, this is Hylae. The demiurge's domain. The second layer is the psychic dimension, what the texts call the psyche. This is not the soul in the popular sense. This is the animating intelligence, the capacity for reasoning, for moral judgment, for religious feeling, for the experience of meaning. The psychic layer is capable of reaching towards something higher. It can feel the pull of truth, but it can also be satisfied with approximations of truth. It can mistake a symbol for the thing the symbol points to. It can confuse a religious institution with the divine reality that institution claims to represent. Most human beings, in the Gnostic framework, operate primarily at the psychic level. They feel something real. They reach towards something real. And then they stop at the nearest available structure that seems to contain what they're reaching for: the church, the doctrine, the moral framework, the community. These are psychic satisfactions, real as far as they go, but not the whole structure. And then there is the third layer, the pneuma. The word translates directly as breath or spirit. But in the Gnostic cosmological system, pneuma means something far more specific than that translation suggests. The pneuma is the fragment of pleromatic consciousness that was embedded in human beings not by the demiurge, not by the archons, but through the action of the higher divine realm working inside the flawed creation without the demiurge's knowledge or consent. This is the claim that makes Gnosticism categorically different from any other religious tradition in the ancient world. Not that human beings have souls. Virtually every religious tradition makes that claim. The Gnostic claim is that some human beings carry inside them something that is literally and ontologically not from this universe, not metaphorically from a higher realm, not spiritually connected to the divine, actually made of what the pleroma is made of, the same substance, the same nature. The Apocryphon of John, discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945 and dated by scholars to somewhere around the late 2nd century, though drawing on traditions considerably older, describes a specific moment when the divine spark was placed inside the first human being. The demiurge, Yaldabaoth, had constructed the human body, had assembled it from the material he had available, and the resulting creature was incomplete, unable to stand, unable to sustain itself. A physical form without the animating principle that would make it fully alive. And so the higher powers operating through a kind of celestial stratagem caused the divine breath, the pneuma, to flow downward through the archonic levels and into the form Yaldabaoth had built. Yaldabaoth breathed into the form, believing the breath was his own to give. He was wrong. What flowed through him and into the human body was not his. It came from above him, from the pleroma itself. And the creature that stood up was therefore more than the demiurge had created. It was carrying something he had not authorized, something he could not subsequently remove. This is not a creation myth in the conventional sense. This is a description of a theft, or more precisely, a rescue operation embedded inside a theft. The divine realm used the demiurge's own creative impulse as a vehicle to install something in his creation that would eventually undo his control over it. You are the product of that installation. If you are pneumatic, if you carry that third layer, then what you are, at your deepest stratum, is plerommatic. Not human in the conventional biological sense, not soul in the conventional religious sense, but a fragment of the original undivided fullness that preceded the entire cosmos, temporarily housed in a body that the archons built, temporarily moving through a world the demiurge constructed. But not, in any ultimate sense, from here. That feeling of not quite belonging, the Gnostic texts do not treat that as a psychological problem. They treat it as accurate perception. The Gnostic tradition does not say every human being is pneumatic. This is where the teaching becomes genuinely uncomfortable, and it is also where it has been most systematically misunderstood and misrepresented both by its ancient critics and by its modern enthusiasts. The texts describe three categories of human being, corresponding to the three layers just described. Not everyone carries all three layers in equal proportion. Or, more precisely, not everyone carries a living, activated pneumatic spark. The texts are quite direct about this. The hylics, sometimes called the choics, from the Greek word for earth, are human beings in whom the material layer is entirely dominant. The pneumatic dimension, if it exists at all in them, is so completely buried under the weight of material identification that it generates no upward pull. These are individuals for whom physical survival, pleasure, accumulation, and material security are the totality of meaningful experience. Not because they are stupid, not because they are morally corrupt, now ride, individuals, but because the animating principle of their inner structure is purely material. The texts say plainly that hylics cannot be saved in the Gnostic sense, not because they are condemned, but because there is no pneumatic fragment in them to be awakened. There is nothing to remember. There is nothing to return. This claim disturbs people. It disturbed people in the ancient world too. The 2nd century bishop Irenaeus of Lyon, one of the most energetic early opponents of Gnostic teaching, attacked this doctrine specifically and repeatedly in his work against heresies, written around 180 CE. Irenaeus argued that the Gnostics were creating a spiritual aristocracy, dividing humanity into the saved and the irredeemably lost based on inner constitution rather than moral choice. He was not entirely wrong about what they were claiming. He was, the Gnostics would have said, simply describing the structure of reality rather than a moral judgment. The psychics occupy the middle ground. They feel the pull of something higher. They have genuine religious experience. They can reason about ultimate things. They are capable of meaningful spiritual development. In the Valentinian school, one of the most sophisticated and widely influential Gnostic movements, founded by the teacher Valentinus, who was active in Rome around 140 to 160 CE, the psychics were not dismissed. They were simply operating at a different level of realization. They could reach a kind of salvation, the Valentinians said, not the full plerommatic return, but a genuine positive destiny. The demiurge himself, in the Valentinian framework, is psychic rather than purely hylic. He is capable of a kind of good, even if it is the limited good of a limited mind. And then there are the pneumatics. The pneumatics are the ones in whom the divine spark is active, awakened, or in the process of awakening. The Gnostic path, the entire structure of myth, ritual, and gnosis, is designed specifically for them. Not because the teachers are indifferent to everyone else, but because the medicine is calibrated to a specific condition. You do not prescribe chemotherapy to someone who does not have cancer. The pneumatic is the one who has the condition that gnosis cures. How do you know which one you are? The texts don't give you a quiz. They give you a description and trust you to recognize yourself or not. If the description of the pneumatic condition resonates with something you already know from the inside, that recognition is itself considered evidence. If it lands as interesting theology but does not feel like a description of your own nature, that is also information. What does the pneumatic feel like from the inside? The texts are actually quite specific. There is a persistent sense of displacement, of not quite belonging to the world in which you find yourself. Not depression, not social anxiety, not misanthropy, though any of those can coexist with it. Something more fundamental than those. A sense that the categories and meanings the surrounding culture offers don't map onto something you experience as real. A pull towards something that can't be named using the available vocabulary. A feeling sometimes faint, sometimes overwhelming that what you are is not what you've been told you are. Valentinus himself, who by all available historical accounts was a figure of genuine philosophical sophistication and not a charlatan, described this as the pneuma recognizing itself. The spark doesn't need to be taught that it came from light. It knows. The work of gnosis is not to introduce new information into a blank mind. The work of gnosis is to remove what has been placed over the knowing that was always already there. That is a completely different model of spiritual transformation than anything Orthodox Christianity or conventional secular philosophy offers. And it has radical practical implications that the next sections of this video will walk through in full. The word gnosis is used constantly in discussions of this tradition and defined almost never. That needs to change, because if you misunderstand gnosis, you misunderstand everything the tradition is actually doing. Every text, every ritual, every cosmological claim in the entire Gnostic corpus is organized around gnosis as its center. Get gnosis wrong and the whole system looks like mythology. Get it right and the whole system looks like a precision instrument. Gnosis is a Greek word. It means knowledge. But the Greek language has two entirely distinct words for knowledge, and the distinction between them is exactly the distinction that makes Gnosticism make sense. The first word is episteme knowledge, that is propositional, factual, acquired through study and observation. I know that the earth orbits the Sunday. I know that Valentinus taught in Rome in the 2nd century. I know the atomic weight of carbon. This is episteme. You did not have it, you were taught it. You can pass it to someone else, in the form of a statement. The second word is gnosis, and gnosis is the direct, experiential, self-verifying recognition of a truth that you do not merely know about, but know from within. The difference is not subtle. It is the difference between reading a description of swimming and the experience of water closing over your body. It is the difference between studying a map of a city and knowing that city because you have walked every street in it, in every kind of weather. Episteme describes. Gnosis transforms. The Gnostic teachers were entirely clear about this distinction. Irenaeus, attacking them from outside, actually describes their teaching accurately on this point, even as he condemns it. The Gnostics claimed that knowledge of the cosmological system, the demiurge, the archons, the pleroma, the divine spark was not itself gnosis. It was preparation for gnosis. You needed the framework the way you need a map, but carrying the map is not the same as making the journey. So what is the journey? The Valentinian text called the Gospel of Truth, a text which many scholars believe was written by Valentinus himself, making it one of the rare cases in ancient Gnostic literature where we may have a primary document from a named founder, describes gnosis as a moment of waking from a nightmare, not a metaphor for improvement, not a metaphor for moral progress, a metaphor for the recognition that what you took to be reality was a constructed dream, and that you, the one who had the dream, were never identical with the dreamer inside the dream. That is the structure of what gnosis does. It does not add something to your experience. It removes the identification with a false layer of experience that you had mistaken for the whole. The pleroma was never absent from you. You were absent from yourself, or more precisely, the false self, constructed by hylic and psychic conditioning, had become so solid that the pneumatic reality underneath it had become imperceptible. The Apocryphon of John uses the language of sleep and waking for this. The archons, it says, produced a sleep over the first human being. Not a literal sleep, a forgetting, an anamnesis in reverse, an active forgetting of origin, of nature, of what the pneuma actually is. The Gnostic path, in every school and every variation, is the process of reversing that forgetting. Anamnesis, unforgetting, the slow and sometimes violent recognition of what you are underneath everything that has been layered over it. This is also why gnosis is not a belief system in the conventional sense. You do not believe your way into gnosis. You cannot argue your way into it. You cannot be convinced of it by a sufficiently compelling lecture or a sufficiently well-structured YouTube video. What you can do is use those external frameworks to position yourself at the threshold of a recognition that can only happen in your own interior. The teacher in the ancient Gnostic model, in Valentinus' school, in the tradition of Thomas, in the Gospel of Thomas, does not give you the truth. The teacher removes obstacles between you and a truth you already possess but cannot currently access. The Gospel of Thomas, which opens with the line, These are the secret words which the living Jesus spoke, and Didymos Judas Thomas wrote down, contains a saying attributed to Jesus that captures this precisely. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. And this is not an ethical instruction. This is a description of the pneumatic condition. What is within you is not something you put there. It is what you are, underneath what you've been made into. Bringing it forth is gnosis, and this is why the demiurge feared it. Not because it would challenge his authority in some political sense, because a being who knows what it actually is cannot be fully controlled by a system that depends on that being not knowing. Before there was a material world, before there was a demiurge, before there was a system of archons maintaining the structure of a cosmos built on forgetfulness, there was a catastrophe inside the pleroma itself. This is the myth of Sophia. And it is not a myth in the dismissive sense, a story people believed before they knew better. It is a myth in the precise sense, a narrative that encodes a cosmological and philosophical claim in a form that can be understood at multiple levels simultaneously. The Gnostic teachers knew exactly what they were doing when they told it. Sophia is an aeon, one of the paired divine emanations that constitute the living fabric of the pleroma. Her name means wisdom. In the hierarchical structure of pleromatic being, she is positioned at the outermost edge of the pleroma, the boundary condition of the fullness. The aeon, whose nature brings her closest to the limit where pleromatic reality borders on what lies outside it. Her position is not an accident. It is the cosmological setup for what happens next. Sophia desired to know the monad, the unknowable source, the ungenerated first principle, directly. Not through her syzygy, her divine partner, the paired aeon whose relationship mediates and stabilizes her existence within the pleroma. Not through the graduated emanation that characterizes the proper pleromatic order of knowing, directly, without mediation. Without the structural relationships that keep every pleromatic being in dynamic equilibrium with the whole. Different Gnostic schools describe the motivation differently. The Valentinian tradition is careful not to frame Sophia's desire as sinful in the moral sense. She was not being wicked. She was being maximally herself, expressing the deepest drive of what she was, which was the desire for wisdom, for direct knowing, for the source. The problem was not the desire. The problem was the attempt to enact that desire without the mediation that the structure of reality requires. Even in the pleroma, even in the realm of perfect fullness, there are conditions. The monad cannot be apprehended directly, because the monad is the condition of all apprehension. Trying to grasp it directly is like trying to see your own eye without a mirror. The very tool you're using to see is the thing you cannot see through itself. Sophia reached, and something went wrong. What the texts describe varies in its precise imagery, but the structure of what happens is consistent across the major Sethian and Valentinian sources. Sophia's reaching produced something, an emanation, a byproduct of the failed attempt at direct knowing. Something that had the formal structure of a being but lacked the pleromatic fullness that all genuine emanations carry. A being shaped by Sophia's desire but not grounded in the balanced wholeness of pleromatic relationship. This being, this product of the failure rather than the fullness, was Yaldabaoth, the demiurge. Sophia, immediately recognizing what had been produced, acted to conceal it. In the Apocryphon of John, she moved it away from the pleromatic realm, surrounded it with a luminous cloud, and withdrew. She did not want the other aeons to see what her reaching had produced. This act of concealment, well-intentioned, protective, but itself a further deviation from transparency, compounded the original problem. The demiurge was now alone, separated from the pleroma, without any corrective input from the fullness that might have oriented him differently. He had Sophia's light, because she was his source. He carried some of what she was, but he had no context for understanding what that light meant or where it had come from. Yaldabaoth looked around at the emptiness surrounding him and concluded he was alone. He concluded he was the first. He concluded, therefore, that he was the highest. He declared, and this is reported across multiple Gnostic texts with remarkable consistency, "I am God, and there is no other God beside me." This declaration, this assertion of primacy by a being who was in fact derivative, who was in fact secondary, who had a source he was entirely unaware of, is the foundational error of the material cosmos. Everything that follows from it is built on that mistake. The archons are built on it. The material world is built on it. The conditions of forgetfulness that human beings are born into are built on it, and embedded in the Sophia myth is something the texts want you to notice about Sophia's fate. She did not remain in the state her fall produced. the Pleroma did not abandon her. In the Valentinian account, a specific aeon Christ, functioning here not as the historical Jesus but as a pleromatic being, was sent to stabilize Sophia, to restore her to equilibrium, to reintegrate the wisdom that had stretched too far back into the relational structure she had departed from. She was not saved by obedience. She was not saved by repentance in the conventional religious sense. She was stabilized by a restoration of the relational fullness she had tried to bypass. This is not incidental to the myth. The structure of Sophia's fall and restoration is the template for what happens to the pneumatic spark inside human beings, and the template for what Gnosis is designed to accomplish. The spark fell into the material world, the same way Sophia fell toward the edge of the Pleroma through a reaching that exceeded the available structure, and the return follows the same pattern. Not punishment, not moral rehabilitation. Restoration to the fullness that was always the spark's actual nature and actual home. Now we need to talk about the archons. Because Sophia's fall did not happen in a vacuum, the moment her reaching exceeded the available structure, something came into being that was not supposed to exist, and that something did not remain passive. It organized, it built, it ruled. The word archon comes from the Greek. It means ruler, governor, the one who presides over a domain. In standard Greek usage, it referred to magistrates, civic officials, the people who administered power in a city-state. The Gnostic text took that word and applied it to something far older and far more dangerous than any municipal official. The archons, in the Gnostic framework, are the beings who govern the material cosmos, not metaphorically, not as symbols of psychological tendencies, as actual ruling intelligences embedded in the structure of the created world, maintaining the conditions that keep the pneumatic spark disoriented, distracted, and unable to remember what it actually is. The Apocryphon of John, the foundational Sethian text discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945 and dated by scholars to approximately the 2nd century CE, describes the archons in extensive detail. The text names them. It assigns them specific domains, specific characteristics, specific methods of operation. This is not vague cosmological poetry. It is a precise taxonomy of the forces the Gnostic tradition held responsible for the condition of the material world. The chief archon is the demiurge, the craftsman, the builder, the entity the tradition usually names Yaldabaoth, though other texts give him different names. We will return to him at length. But below the demiurge, the texts describe a hierarchy of 7 archons, each presiding over one of the 7 planetary spheres that ancient cosmology understood as the layers between the material Earth and the true divine realm above. Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, the Moon, 7 spheres, 7 governors, 7 layers of a prison whose walls are made of cosmic law rather than stone. Each archon, according to the Apocryphon of John, imprints a specific quality onto the soul as it descends through the spheres on its way into material incarnation. Not a gift, an imprint, a kind of conditioning that makes the soul forget where it came from and believe the material world is the only real thing there is. Ignorance, desire, grief, fear, the kingdom of the flesh, foolish fleshly wisdom, wrathful wisdom. 7 layers of forgetting, administered by 7 governing intelligences, accumulated one by one as the spark descends toward birth. This is not abstract. The Gnostic texts are making a specific claim about why human beings arrive in the world already confused, already oriented toward material things, already convinced that survival, acquisition, social belonging, and bodily satisfaction are the primary coordinates of existence. The archons are the structural explanation for the condition the Gnostics observed in themselves and in the people around them, the condition of sleepwalking through a world that feels vaguely wrong, unable to locate the source of the wrongness, unable to stop engaging with the very structures that maintain the forgetting. The hypostasis of the archons, another Nag Hammadi text, develops this picture further. This text describes the archons as entities with a specific motivation, not evil in the way a villain in a story is evil, not defined by cruelty for its own sake, but defined by something more structurally disturbing. They do not want to be seen clearly. Their governing principle is concealment. The material world, in this reading, is not simply a fallen creation, it is a managed environment. The archons maintain the conditions of ignorance, because ignorance is the foundation of their authority. The moment the pneumatic spark genuinely remembers what it is, the archon's jurisdiction over that spark ends. Their power is entirely contingent on the forgetting remaining intact. This is the part of Gnostic cosmology that most people raised in conventional religious frameworks have never encountered. The idea that the world is not simply imperfect or fallen in the Augustinian sense, not a good creation damaged by human sin and awaiting divine repair, but actively administered by intelligences whose function is the perpetuation of ignorance. It changes the entire diagnostic framework. The question is not, what did humanity do wrong? The question is, what is being done to humanity and why? And the answer the Gnostic texts give is precise. The archons maintain their domain by ensuring the spark never develops the orientation of mind that would allow it to recognize itself. They do not need to be violent. They do not need to be obvious. They only need the forgetting to hold. Of all the figures in the Gnostic cosmological system, none is more jarring, none is more philosophically explosive, and none has been more viciously suppressed by institutional Christianity than Yaldabaoth. Because Yaldabaoth is not a demon in the conventional sense. He is not a fallen angel in the Judeo-Christian tradition's understanding of that term. He is the craftsman of the material world. He is, in the Gnostic reading, the being that the Hebrew scriptures call God. Let that land. The deity worshipped in mainstream Judaism and mainstream Christianity, the creator of heaven and earth, the God of Genesis, the lawgiver of Sinai, is identified in the Gnostic texts as a lower-order being, a being who emerged from Sophia's fall, a being who does not have access to the true divine source, a being who, crucially, does not know that anything exists above him. And from that ignorance, the texts say, he made a declaration that sealed the condition of the material world. He looked at the cosmos he had built and declared himself the only God. The Apocryphon of John contains the statement directly, Yaldabaoth, having generated the material cosmos out of the chaotic substance that emerged from Sophia's fall, declared, and this is the text's own language, I am a jealous God, and there is no other God beside me. The Gnostic reading of this line from Exodus 20-5 is precise and devastating. If there is no other God beside you, why would you need to say so? The declaration of uniqueness implies the awareness of a rival. The very jealousy implies a prior reality the declaration is trying to erase. A truly singular being does not need to announce its singularity. The announcement is itself evidence of the concealment. Yaldabaoth, in the Gnostic framework, is not omniscient. He is not omnipotent. He is a powerful being, genuinely powerful, genuinely capable of creating and governing a complex material world. But he is operating in ignorance of the pleroma above him, and that ignorance is the fundamental problem. He built a world, and he built it well, by the standards of material construction. But he built it without the light of the true divine source, because he does not have access to that light. What he does have, the texts explain, is a stolen fragment, the luminous power that came from Sophia, and that was transmitted, however imperfectly, into the structure of the material world he built. The secret book of John elaborates this in ways that are philosophically extraordinary. When Yaldabaoth breathes life into the material human body he and his archons have constructed, he is not giving humanity a gift from his own divine substance. He is inadvertently transmitting the fragment of Sophia's light that he has been carrying without understanding. The breath of life that animates the human being contains, within it, the pneumatic spark, the actual piece of divine consciousness from the pleroma that got embedded in material reality through the cascade of Sophia's fall. Yaldabaoth did not intend this. He did not know what he was transmitting. And when the archons noticed that the human being they had made suddenly had a luminosity they did not possess, the texts say they were disturbed. They put the human being into the material world specifically to contain that luminosity, to keep it embodied, to keep it distracted, to keep it from ascending back to the source Yaldabaoth himself cannot perceive. This is one of the most structurally brilliant moves in the entire Gnostic cosmological system. The oppressor contains within himself the seed of the liberation he is trying to prevent. Yaldabaoth is the unwilling carrier of the very light the pneumatic spark needs to recognize in order to return home. He cannot destroy the spark. He can only obscure it. And his methods of obscuring it, the archons, the planetary conditioning, the weight of material existence, the structures of law and obligation and fear, are all responses to a fundamental insecurity he does not fully understand. He is afraid of what he is carrying without knowing what it is. The Gospel of Philip, a Valentinian text from Nag Hammadi dated to approximately the 3rd century CE, frames this differently but points to the same structure. The God of this world, the text suggests, is not the enemy of the divine. He is its unknowing instrument. His very existence is a consequence of the Pleroma's generative excess. And his ultimate function, however unintended, is to provide the conditions under which the pneumatic spark develops, the specific quality of consciousness that only comes through limitation, through forgetting, through the experience of a world that seems to be all there is. None of this is in the Bible. None of this is in the Catechism. This is what the church councils of the 2nd and 3rd centuries called heresy, not because it was incoherent, because it was too coherent. Because it provided an explanation that the institution could not absorb without dismantling itself. You are not what you have been told you are. This is not a motivational statement. This is not spiritual encouragement dressed up in ancient language. This is the specific anthropological claim the Gnostic texts make, and it has structural consequences that run through everything else in this system. The mainstream account of human nature, whether you encountered it through religion, through secular materialism, or through the general cultural atmosphere of the modern West, gives you essentially two options. Either you are a biological organism whose consciousness is a byproduct of neural complexity, significant only to yourself and your immediate social network, destined for dissolution when the body fails, or you are a created being made by a personal God who assigned you a soul, gave you moral obligations, and holds you accountable to a standard you will be judged against after death. These are the two dominant frameworks. They disagree about almost everything. They agree on one thing: your nature is derivative. You were either made by impersonal biological processes or by a personal divine craftsman. In both cases, you came from something other than the highest possible source, and your significance is entirely contingent on factors outside yourself. The Gnostic anthropology is structurally different, not slightly different, categorically different. The Gnostic texts describe the human being as containing three distinct layers: the material body hyle, the Greek word for matter, which is entirely the construction of the demiurge and his archons; a second layer called the psyche, the soul, the animating principle that the mainstream religious tradition takes to be the essential self; and a third layer, the pneuma, the spirit, the spark, the piece of actual pleromic consciousness that got transmitted into material existence through the cascade of Sophia's fall and Yaldabaoth's inadvertent carrying of her light. Most human beings, in the Gnostic framework, are operating primarily at the level of hyle or psyche. They are engaged with the material world on the material world's own terms, or they are engaged with it through the lens of a soul that is shaped by the archon's conditioning and the demiurge's religion. This is not a moral failure, it is a structural condition. The spark is present in all human beings. The texts do not claim it is absent in the non-pneumatic. What differs is the degree to which the spark has been activated, or more precisely, the degree to which the individual is oriented toward the spark rather than toward the outer layers. The Tripartite Tractate, a Valentinian text from Nag Hammadi, describes these three orientations in detail. Those oriented primarily toward matter, the hylics, are not condemned by the texts, so much as described as people for whom the material world is entirely real and entirely sufficient. They do not experience the alienation that characterizes the pneumatic. The material world satisfies them because they are, in terms of their orientation, entirely of it. Those oriented toward the soul, the psychics, are capable of religious experience, of moral aspiration, of reaching toward something higher. But they reach through the framework the demiurge has provided, which means they reach toward Yaldabaoth rather than toward the true divine source. The mainstream religious traditions, in this reading, are psychic frameworks, genuine expressions of spiritual aspiration that are nonetheless aimed at the wrong target. And then there are the pneumatics, the ones in whom the spark has been activated or is in the process of activation. The ones who experience what the Gnostic texts describe as the recognition, not the acquisition of new information, but the remembering of what was always already the case. You know that feeling you've had your entire life? That sense that the world around you is real but not quite real enough? That your actual life is somehow happening at a register slightly different from the one everyone else seems to be operating on? The Gnostic texts give that feeling a name, a structural explanation, and a cosmological context. It is not alienation in the psychiatric sense. It is the spark recognizing, however dimly and however briefly, that the material world is not its origin and not its home. This is also what our video on the 7 levels of the pleroma was pointing toward. One viewer put it precisely: Level 4 isn't as much fun as some might think. I spend so much time with a feeling of fullness in my brain, a deep need to push all the ideas out. That is not a disorder. In the Gnostic framework, that is the pneuma, pressing against the boundaries of a container that was not designed to hold it. The pressure is the recognition wanting to complete itself. The Gnostic texts do not say you need to become something you are not. They say you need to remember what you already are underneath everything the archons have layered over the spark. The pneuma does not need to be created, it needs to be uncovered. And the process of uncovering it is what the entire Gnostic practical tradition, the rituals, the texts, the communities, the contemplative practices, was designed to accomplish. The Gnostic classification of human beings into three types is one of the most controversial aspects of the entire tradition, and also one of the most consistently misunderstood. Let me be precise about what it is and what it is not. It is not a permanent metaphysical caste system. It is not a declaration that some human beings have souls and some do not, in any absolute or final sense. It is not an excuse for spiritual elitism, for treating other people as irredeemably lost, for a religious community to congratulate itself on its specialness while writing off everyone outside its walls. The Gnostic texts that developed this classification, primarily the Valentinian school, with the tripartite tractate and the Gospel of Philip as the central documents are describing orientations, not fixed essences. The distinction is functional, not ontological in the crudest sense. With that said, the classification is real, and it matters enormously for understanding how the tradition saw both its own purpose and its relationship to the broader human population. The hylic type, from the Greek word hyle, matter describes a human being whose entire operational center of gravity is located in the material world. Satisfaction, meaning, identity, and purpose are drawn entirely from material sources. Physical pleasure, social status, economic security, sensory experience, these are not supplemented by any reaching towards something beyond the material frame. This is not contemptible in the Gnostic understanding. The hyle is doing exactly what the demiurge designed the material human being to do. There is a kind of terrible coherence to it, but it means the pneumatic spark, to whatever degree it is present, remains entirely dormant. The orientation never turns inward and upward. The signal never finds a receiver. The psychic type from psyche, soul, is more complex and more interesting. This is the person who has genuine spiritual aspiration, genuine moral seriousness, genuine reaching towards something beyond the purely material. They feel the pull of the transcendent. They organize their lives around it. But the framework through which they pursue it is the framework the demiurge provided the mainstream religious systems, the moral codes handed down through institutional religion, the God of law and commandment and judgment. The psychic is reaching toward the divine through the only channel the archons have left open, which is the channel that points toward the demiurge, rather than through him toward the pleroma beyond. The reaching is real. The target is wrong. This is the Gnostic assessment of mainstream religion, not that it is fraudulent, not that its practitioners are stupid or deceived in any simple sense, but that it is a genuine spiritual impulse that has been routed through a cosmological misdirection. The person praying to the God of the Old Testament is reaching towards something real. But what they are reaching toward is Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, a powerful being who is himself ignorant of the pleroma and therefore constitutionally incapable of transmitting gnosis, regardless of how sincere the encounter feels. The pneumatic type is the one in whom the spark has reached a threshold of activation that makes direct recognition possible. Not guaranteed, not automatic, but structurally available. The Valentinian texts describe the pneumatic as the one who, when they encounter the Gnostic teaching, experiences something specific, not the pleasant satisfaction of learning interesting new information, but a recognition that arrives with the quality of memory rather than discovery. The Greek word anamnesis captures it, unforgetting, not learning something new, remembering something that was always already known at a level below the level of ordinary consciousness. If you're drawn to this material, not just intellectually interested, but pulled by it in a way that feels older than your current life, more structural than a passing fascination, that is the phenomenology the pneumatic classification is pointing toward. Not because you are special in some social or moral sense, because the spark recognizes the map that was drawn to describe its condition. The Valentinian teacher Ptolemy, writing around 160 CE, is explicit that the pneumatic type does not earn its orientation through effort or virtue. It is a structural fact about where the spark is in its process of unfolding. The pneumatic cannot take credit for it. The psychic cannot be blamed for not being it. The hylic cannot be condemned for the orientation that the material world impresses so completely onto their experience. Each type is, in the Valentinian reading, doing what its current configuration makes possible. But here is the crucial move the tradition makes, and this is where it separates itself from pure determinism. The Gnostic teaching exists precisely because the pneumatic orientation, while it may be structurally present, still requires encounter with Gnosis to activate fully. The spark may be there, the orientation may be there, but without the specific knowledge, the cosmological map, the recognition of what the material world is, the understanding of what the pneuma actually is and where it came from, the pneumatic person lives their entire life in the condition the Gnostic texts call the sleep within the sleep, present to their own nature but unable to name it, awake enough to feel the wrongness of the cage but not yet awake enough to see the door. So let's talk about what Gnosis actually does when it arrives, because this is where most modern presentations of Gnosticism get it completely wrong. They treat Gnosis as a belief system, a set of doctrines you adopt, a philosophical position you take up, as if the difference between a Gnostic and a non-Gnostic is simply that the Gnostic has read different books and come to different conclusions. That is not what the texts describe. Gnosis is not acquiring a belief. It is not swapping one worldview for another. The Apocryphon of John, one of the central texts recovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, a text scholars date to somewhere between the late 1st and early 2nd century, describes Gnosis in terms that have nothing to do with intellectual acceptance of propositions. The text frames it as awakening from sleep, as light entering a sealed room. As the moment a person who has been walking in a dream suddenly becomes aware that they are dreaming, the distinction matters enormously. When you adopt a belief, you add something to your existing self-concept. You were a person who believed X, now you are a person who believes Y. The self, doing the believing, is unchanged. Gnosis, as the Gnostic texts describe it, does not add to the self. It removes the overlay. It does not give you new information so much as it strips away the misidentification that has been running your entire life. Think of it this way. Imagine you have been walking around your entire life convinced you are the costume you are wearing. Someone shows you a mirror. Not to tell you what you look like, to show you what you actually are underneath the costume. The costume does not disappear. You are still wearing it, but your relationship to it has permanently changed. You know what it is now. You know what you are beneath it. That knowledge cannot be unfelt. It cannot be unseen. This is why the Valentinian tradition, the school of thought associated with the teacher Valentinus, who was active in Rome around 140 CE, described Gnosis using the Greek term anamnesis, unforgetting, not learning, not being taught, unforgetting. The prefix an negates amnesis, which means forgetting. Anamnesis is the reversal of amnesia. It is the recovery of something that was always there, buried under layers of imposed forgetfulness. Valentinus himself, writing fragments that survive in later heresiological sources, texts written by his opponents, which is a significant irony, described the pneumatic person's encounter with Gnosis, not as a conversion, but as a recognition. And this is a direct paraphrase of his recorded position. The soul, on receiving Gnosis, does not become something it was not. It recognizes what it always was, but had forgotten. This is a completely different ontological claim than what mainstream religion offers. Mainstream religion, in virtually every form, tells you that you need to become something. You need to be saved, transformed, elevated, made worthy. The entire apparatus of doctrine, sacrament, moral law, and institutional authority is built around the project of making you into something you currently are not. Gnosis inverts this entirely. You do not need to become anything. You need to remember what you already are. The difference is not semantic, it is structural. One framework generates permanent dependence on an external institution. The other dissolves the need for the institution altogether, which is precisely why the institution moved to destroy it. The Gospel of Truth, a text associated with Valentinus, discovered at Nag Hammadi, dated by scholars to approximately 150 CE, opens with an extended meditation on the condition of ignorance. And it describes ignorance not as a failure of education, but as a kind of induced fog, a cloud that settles over the pneuma and causes it to forget its origin. This fog is not natural. The text implies it is the condition of being embedded in material existence, in a cosmos that was constructed without the light of the pleroma, shaped by a power that had itself forgotten where it came from. When Gnosis arrives, what happens is not that the fog is explained to you. What happens is that the fog lifts. And the person who was navigating entirely by feel, who was sensing the wrongness of things without being able to articulate why, suddenly has a map. Not just any map, a map that names the territory they have been living in, names the power that constructed that territory, names what they are beneath the persona the territory imposed on them, and points toward something the Valentinian texts call the return. The return. We will spend a great deal of time on this, but for now, understand this. Gnosis is the moment the pneumatic person moves from sensing the cage to seeing it clearly, from feeling the wrongness to naming its source. It is not comfort. It is not consolation. In the immediate experience, many of the Gnostic texts suggest it is disorienting, even frightening, because it means that everything you have organized your life around, every explanation, every institution, every framework of meaning that the material world offers you now see with absolute clarity as partial, distorted, or outright false. Before the material world existed, before a single atom of matter was assembled into the architecture of what we call reality, the Gnostic texts describe something going wrong, not evil in the conventional sense, not a war between good and evil forces, something more subtle and in some ways more disturbing, an error that produced a universe. The figure the texts use to name this error is the demiurge, from the Greek demiurgos, the craftsman, the maker, the one who works with existing material to construct things. Plato used this term in the Timaeus to describe the divine craftsman who shaped the material world according to eternal forms. The Gnostics took the term and transformed its meaning entirely. In the Gnostic cosmology, the demiurge is not a benevolent craftsman enacting divine will. The demiurge is a blind, self-deluded power who believes himself to be God and is not. This is not a minor theological adjustment. This is one of the most radical reversals in the history of religious thought. The God of the Old Testament, the God who declares himself jealous, who commands genocide, who hardens Pharaoh's heart, who tells Abraham to kill his son, who instructs the Israelites to destroy entire populations, the Gnostics identified this figure directly with the demiurge, not as an allegory, not as a metaphor for human projection. They meant it literally and systematically. The creator God of the Hebrew Scriptures is, in the Gnostic reading, the blind craftsman, a being of limited consciousness, vast power, and catastrophic self-deception. He does not know that above him, infinitely above him, there exists the true source, the monad, the pleroma. He believes he is the highest. He declares, in language the Gnostic texts quote directly from the Hebrew Scriptures, "I am a jealous God, there is no other God besides me." The Apocryphon of John preserves what it presents as the deeper reading of that declaration. It renders the demiurge's statement as a confession of ignorance, rather than a claim of supremacy. If there is no other God besides me, why would a truly supreme being need to say so? The declaration of jealousy, the Apocryphon argues, is the tell. A being who actually was the source of all things would have nothing to be jealous of. The jealousy reveals the limitation, the insistence reveals the uncertainty. The demiurge has a name in the Apocryphon of John. Yaldabaoth. The etymology is disputed. Various scholars have proposed Aramaic and Hebrew roots, but the text itself describes him as lion-faced, as combining the power of fire and the blindness of matter, as a being who emerged from the era of Sophia, the aeon of wisdom, and who, finding himself alone in the void below the pleroma, mistook his isolation for sovereignty. He looked around and saw nothing above him because he was not capable of perceiving the pleroma, and concluded that he was alone, therefore supreme. This is the founding moment of the material cosmos, not a creation from love, not a rational emanation from perfect source. A mistake made by a being who did not know what he was, who did not know where he came from, who built an entire universe in the image of his own incomprehension. The hypostasis of the archons, another Nag Hammadi text, dated by scholars to approximately the 3rd century, expands on what the demiurge then does. He does not work alone. He generates subordinate powers, the archons, literally the rulers, from the Greek archon meaning ruler or first principle, 7 of them in most of the texts. Some texts give them names that correspond to planetary rulers in the cosmological framework of the ancient world. Others give them names that correspond directly to angels and powers named in the Hebrew Scriptures. The Gnostics were not randomly generating mythology. They were offering a systematic rereading of existing religious material, proposing that the powers named in official religion as divine servants were actually the wardens of the prison. The archons, in the Gnostic system, govern the material cosmos. They preside over the planetary spheres. They maintain the conditions of ignorance, limitation, and suffering that characterize material existence. They are not evil in a metaphysically independent sense. They are expressions of the demiurge's blindness, extensions of his self-delusion, administrators of a cosmos built on the fundamental error of a power that did not know it was not God. And into this cosmos, this vast architectural mistake, this prison built from the confusion of a limited being who thought he was the source of everything human beings are placed, not randomly. The Apocryphon of John describes a specific transaction around the creation of the human being that explains everything about the condition the Gnostic texts are trying to address. This is where the stakes of the entire cosmology become personal. This is where the abstract architecture of aeons and archons and demiurges stops being mythology and becomes the explanation for why you feel the way you feel. The Apocryphon of John contains one of the most remarkable cosmological narratives in the ancient world, and I want to walk through it carefully because the standard summary humanity was created by a lower god who trapped divine sparks in matter, loses almost everything that makes the actual text extraordinary. Here is what the text describes, as close to the source as a paraphrase allows. Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, and the archons decide to create a human being. Their model is an image they have received from above, a luminous form that briefly appeared in the waters beneath the pleroma, a reflection of the true divine human that exists in the higher realms. They want to capture this form, to encase it in matter, to create a body that resembles divinity but is governed by their powers. They proceed. They construct a physical form. The text describes this in extraordinary detail, assigning different archons responsibility for different parts of the body, different aspects of consciousness, different physiological systems. The resulting creation is a body, but it is inert. It cannot move, it cannot think, it has no animating principle. It is a shell in the shape of something divine. Yaldabaoth cannot give it life. He has power, but the specific power required to animate the human form is not his to give. Life, real life, the kind that moves and perceives and is conscious, comes from the pleroma, and Yaldabaoth has no access to the pleroma. He is cut off from it by his own nature. What happens next in the Apocryphon is the central pivot of the entire Gnostic cosmological system. The pleroma, or more precisely, the higher powers within the pleroma, acting in a kind of compassionate strategy, advises Yaldabaoth to breathe into the human form, to breathe the spirit into the face of the body. The implication in the text is that Yaldabaoth possesses within himself a portion of light, of pneuma, that came from Sophia because Yaldabaoth emerged from Sophia's error, and Sophia is an aeon of the pleroma, and that pleromic light was transferred to Yaldabaoth in his generation without his understanding of what he carried. So Yaldabaoth breathes into the human form, and in doing so, without knowing what he is doing, without understanding what he carries, he transfers that pleromic light into the human body. The pneuma descends, the body animates, the human being comes to life. And immediately, the Apocryphon notes, the resulting human being is luminous, powerful, and more alive than the archons who created the body. The archons look at what they have made and are disturbed. They wanted a creature they could govern. What stands before them is something that carries within it a light they cannot touch, a consciousness that comes from a source they cannot reach. So they do what limited powers do when confronted with something they cannot control. They move to contain it. They cast the human being into the deepest matter. They surround the pneuma with layers, the physical body, yes, but also what the Apocryphon calls the counterfeit spirit, a kind of psychic overlay that generates attachment, desire, identification with the material, the constant background noise of ego and need and fear that keeps the pneuma's attention locked downward rather than upward. This is the condition the Gnostic texts are describing when they speak of sleep, of forgetting, of the human being living in a dream. It is not metaphor. The counterfeit spirit is a functional mechanism. It keeps the pneumatic person convinced that the material world is what matters, that the self that has desires and fears and attachments is the real self, that the faint sense of something greater that occasionally surfaces is nothing more than mood or imagination. The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, associated with the Valentinian school, dated to approximately the 3rd century, describes this condition with a precision that cuts through centuries of translation. The world came into being through error. The agent who made it wanted to make it imperishable and immortal. He fell short of attaining his desire, for the world never was imperishable, nor, for that matter, was he who made it. The text is saying something stark here. The demiurge did not even achieve his own goal. He wanted permanence. He got entropy. He wanted sovereignty. He got a universe in which everything decays. The prison was not even built well. And in this imperfect prison, in a body constructed by archons from the image of something they didn't understand, animated by a light they accidentally transferred without knowing what it was, there is a pneuma. Yours, the same pneumatic light the texts are describing, surrounded by the counterfeit spirit, embedded in matter, oriented downward by the entire structure of the world, the demiurge built, but carrying within it, beneath everything, the one thing the archons cannot touch, the light from the pleroma, the fragment of what was before all of this, the part of you that does not belong here, and has never belonged here, and on some level has always known it. This is not flattery. This is not the kind of spiritual teaching that tells you are special to keep you engaged. The Gnostic texts are not offering this as comfort. They are offering it as a map, and a map is only useful if you understand the territory it describes. The demiurge did not appear from nowhere. The Gnostic texts are precise about where he came from and why. And that origin story is one of the most philosophically sophisticated narratives in all of ancient religious literature. Her name is Sophia, the Greek word for wisdom. She is an aeon, one of the divine emanations of the pleroma, the last and youngest of the great aeons, situated at the outermost boundary of the divine fullness. And what she does out of an impulse the texts describe variously as desire, yearning, an excess of love, is the event that sets the entire material cosmos in motion. Sophia wants to know the monad directly. The monad, the true, ultimate source, the first principle that the Gnostic texts place at the absolute summit of reality, is known within the pleroma through the mediation of the divine pairs, the syzygies, the male-female eons that together constitute the structure of the pleroma's fullness. Each aeon knows the monad through its complement, through relationship, through the network of pleromic being that constitutes the divine realm. Sophia, in her position at the edge of the pleroma, wants more than mediated knowledge. She wants direct contact, immediate comprehension of the monad, without the filter of the syzygy structure. She wants to know the source the way the source knows itself. And she acts on this impulse without her consort, without the complementary partner that maintains the balance of pleromic emanation. She reaches outward, downward, towards something that isn't there, and in reaching, she generates something from herself that is not properly formed. Not a true aeon, not a proper emanation with the fullness of pleromic light, something partial. Something that bears a likeness to divinity, but lacks its completeness. The Apocryphon of John describes the result as lion-faced, as having the form of a serpent, as being something that came into being through Sophia's passion without her consort's agreement and without the consent of the pleroma. It does not belong in the pleroma. It cannot remain there. It is expelled, or it moves downward of its own nature, into the void below the pleroma, the region of chaos and darkness that exists in the absence of pleromic light. This is Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, born from wisdom's error. The product of an impulse that was itself not wrong in its object. Sophia genuinely loved the monad but catastrophically misaligned in its method. She sought direct knowledge through unilateral action and produced instead a being of vast power and fundamental blindness. What happens to Sophia after this is one of the most layered narratives in the Nag Hammadi library. Different texts treat it differently. Some describe her as falling with her creation, descending into the lower regions in grief and confusion. Others describe her as remaining in the pleroma, but in a diminished state, grieving, until the pleroma acts collectively to correct the error she has caused. The Pistis Sophia, a lengthy Coptic text not part of the Nag Hammadi discovery but related to the same tradition, devotes extraordinary attention to Sophia's condition in the lower realms, her repentance, her cries to the higher light, her gradual restoration through the intervention of the divine realm. But here is the dimension of the Sophia narrative that most summaries miss entirely, and that the Gnostic texts treat as essential. Sophia's impulse, the desire for direct knowledge of the source, is not condemned. Not in the way sin is condemned in orthodox frameworks. The texts do not say Sophia was evil, or proud, or disobedient. They say she was incomplete in her method. She had the right longing and the wrong approach. And this distinction matters, because the Gnostic tradition treats the longing itself, the desire for direct knowledge of the source, for unmediated encounter with the monad, as the very same impulse that drives the pneumatic person toward gnosis. Sophia's error was trying to achieve this alone, through unilateral passion, without the relational structure of the pleroma. The pneumatic person's path toward gnosis corrects this error not by suppressing the longing but by achieving what Sophia could not. direct recognition through the specific form of knowledge gnosis that the higher pleroma sends into the world precisely because of what Sophia's fall produced. The Valentinian tradition sees in the Sophia narrative something almost like a cosmic sacrifice, not intentional. Sophia did not plan to create the material world, but the consequence of her error, the entire architecture of the material cosmos with all its weight and limitation and suffering, becomes the very field in which the pneumatic sparks must learn what Sophia was trying to learn: direct knowledge of the source, anamnesis, the return. This is where the tragedy of the Sophia myth opens into something that is not tragic at all. The fall produced the world, but the world, for all its darkness, is also the place where the return becomes possible. The prison contains within it, in the form of every pneumatic human being it holds, the light that the prison cannot extinguish, and that light is not there by accident. It is there because Sophia reached for the monad, and something of the monad came with her, however broken, however embedded in matter and counterfeit spirit, into the world that her reaching made. So now you understand how the world came to be, a flawed emanation, a realm built not by the true God but by a lesser consciousness that mistook itself for the highest power. And inside that realm, scattered through matter like sparks buried in ash, fragments of divine light that belong somewhere else entirely. But the Gnostic texts do not stop there. They go further, because the demiurge did not build this realm and then walk away. He populated it. He structured it. He created what the texts call archons, a word that translates roughly as rulers or authorities, and he set them in place as the administrative layer of a prison that was never meant to look like a prison. This is not metaphor. This is not symbolic language for psychological states, though it can be read that way. The texts describe the archons in concrete, architectural terms. The Apocryphon of John, dated by scholars to approximately 180 CE and discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, lists 12 archons by name, assigns each of them a specific domain, a specific emotional quality, and a specific role in the management of human consciousness. Let that settle. 12 named entities, each with a function, each governing a layer of the material cosmos. The demiurge, whom that text calls Yaldabaoth, generated the archons from his own substance. He did not create them from pleroma light. He could not, he had no access to it, not directly. He created them from the fire and darkness he himself was made of. Which means the archons are, structurally, extensions of the same ignorance that produced them. They rule a system they do not understand, enforcing a captivity they cannot see the purpose of, because they have no access to the pleroma either. Think about that. The jailers are also imprisoned, not in the same way. They are not fragments of divine light trapped in matter, but they are bounded, limited, operating inside a cosmological layer they cannot see beyond. They are ignorant upward, and they are ignorant inward. They know the system they manage. They do not know what the system was built on top of. The hypostasis of the archons, another Nag Hammadi text, describes the archons attempting to comprehend what they themselves are made of and failing. It describes them looking down at the material they are constructing and declaring it finished, complete, sufficient. It describes their arrogance in exactly the terms the Apocryphon of John applies to Yaldabaoth. I am God, and there is no other God beside me. A declaration of completeness made by something that is not complete. Now, here is where the archon framework becomes personally relevant. The texts are not describing a prison that operates through physical walls. They are describing a prison that operates through the very structure of ordinary human consciousness. The archons govern through what the Nag Hammadi texts call haimarmene, a Greek word meaning fate, or the compulsory mechanism of destiny as managed by the planetary rulers. Haimarmene is the structure of cause and effect as administered by a system that is itself flawed. It is karma without the possibility of liberation through karma alone. It is the accumulated weight of choices made inside a false framework, managed by powers that have no interest in your liberation and every interest in your continued participation in the system they run. The 7 primary archons in the Apocryphon of John are assigned to the 7 classical planets. This is not coincidence, and it is not decoration. The Gnostic cosmologists were drawing on a late antique astronomical framework that treated planetary influence as real and operative. The planets did not merely orbit, they governed. Each planet corresponded to a domain of human experience: emotion, intellect, will, desire, and each was under the administration of an archon whose essential nature was a specific form of spiritual distortion: anger, grief, ignorance, jealousy, desire for domination, excessive wisdom deployed in the service of the system. Each of these is not just a psychological state. Each is described as an archonic principle woven into the structure of material reality itself, a kind of background radiation of distortion that human beings breathe in without ever knowing it is there. You do not feel the archons directly. That is the point. You feel their effects as your own psychology, as your own compulsions, as the inexplicable pull toward things that diminish you, the difficulty in sustaining states of genuine clarity, the way that the material world seems always to demand just enough of your attention to prevent you from looking elsewhere. The texts call this the veil, not a metaphysical object, a functional condition, a managed state of not knowing administered by powers that exist below the level of your conscious perception. This is where the Gnostic account of human experience stops being ancient cosmology and starts being a diagnostic, not of pathology, of structure. The prison is not punishing you, it is managing you. And management, the texts insist, is something that can be understood, named, and ultimately navigated past. Here is the turn. The Gnostic cosmology does not simply describe a sealed, operating prison and leave it there. It describes a flaw in the prison, not a crack that appeared by accident, a structural impossibility that the jailer created himself without realizing what he was doing. When the demiurge, Yaldabaoth, created the first human being, something went wrong. Or more precisely, something went right from the perspective of the pleroma inside a process the demiurge believed he controlled entirely. The account in the Apocryphon of John is precise on this point, and it is worth sitting with. Yaldabaoth and the archons fashioned a human body. They built it according to a pattern, and the text is explicit that the pattern came from above, from the pleroma, transmitted as a reflection that appeared on the waters beneath the divine realm. The archons saw this reflection and tried to replicate it. They built a material body modeled on a divine image they had glimpsed, but could not fully comprehend. The body they built was inert. It had form, but it had no animation, no life force, no interiority. It was, in the language of the text, a body that lay on the earth unable to rise. Then Yaldabaoth was deceived, and this is the word the text uses, deceived by the higher powers into breathing into the human form the divine light that he himself carried. The light that Yaldabaoth contained was not his by right. It was Sophia's light, a fragment of pleroma substance that had descended with her fall and become embedded in the demiurge himself. When he breathed life into the human, he exhaled that light into the body. And the body rose. This is the Gnostic reading of the Genesis creation narrative, not a story of God generously breathing life into clay, a story of a theft in reverse. The divine light that had been trapped in the demiurge was transferred, through his own unwitting act, into the human being he was trying to create as a servant. The demiurge made a slave and accidentally made a vessel of divine light. He built a prison and put the key inside the prisoner. The texts call this divine light the pneuma spirit, in the Greek, or alternatively the divine spark. It is not the soul as institutional Christianity uses the term. The Gnostic anthropology is tripartite. The human being consists of three components: the soma, the body, entirely material, belonging to the archonic realm; the psyche, the soul, an intermediate substance, capable of elevation or degradation, responsive to both the material and the spiritual; and the pneuma, the spirit, the actual divine fragment, the part that belongs to the pleroma and never truly belonged anywhere else. Not every human being carries an operative pneuma. This is one of the most challenging and most consistently misunderstood aspects of the Gnostic framework, and I want to be exact about what the texts actually say. The Valentinian tradition, the school associated with Valentinus, who was teaching in Rome around 140 CE, described three types of human beings. The hylics, from the Greek word for matter, those in whom the material nature dominates entirely. The psychics, those in whom the soul nature is active, capable of faith and moral development, but not of direct gnosis. And the pneumatics, those in whom the divine spark is not only present, but awakening. Valentinus was not describing fixed castes. He was describing dominant orientations. He was describing which layer of the human constitution was most activated, most operative, most in control of the person's fundamental orientation toward reality. A hylic is not damned. A psychic is not limited forever. The categories are descriptive of a present state, not a permanent sentence. But the texts are honest. Not every person feels the pull of gnosis. Not every person experiences the divine spark's restlessness. And the reason some people do, and some people do not, is not a moral judgment. It is a cosmological description of where, in the long descent from pleroma to matter, the divine light is most concentrated. You know that feeling you've had your entire life? That low-level sense that this world is not quite right, not quite enough, that the most real feeling moments of your life have been the ones where the world seemed briefly transparent to something beyond it. The Gnostic texts have a specific name for that feeling. They call it the spark's knowledge of its origin, not metaphysically acquired, not learned, present from birth, buried under the material and psychic layers the archons and the system maintain. The Apocryphon of John calls this the counterfeiting spirit, a second implanted nature that the archons placed alongside the divine spark to keep it confused, distracted, convinced that its restlessness is pathology rather than recognition. The counterfeiting spirit binds. The pneuma remembers. And the entire interior life of the pneumatic human being is, whether they know it or not, the unresolved tension between those two forces. Everything built so far, the pleroma, the fall of Sophia, the demiurge, the archons, the divine spark embedded in matter, all of it is scaffolding, the architecture that holds the one central thing in place. And that central thing is Gnosis. Not Gnosticism as a historical religion, not a set of doctrines to be memorized and affirmed. Gnosis itself, the direct, unmediated knowledge of your own divine origin. The moment the divine spark knows what it is. The word is Greek, it means knowledge. But it is a specific kind of knowledge that the Greek philosophical tradition distinguished carefully from two other kinds. Episteme was knowledge about external things, propositional, verifiable, transmissible through argument. Doxa was opinion or belief held without direct verification, based on testimony or tradition. And gnosis was the third kind, direct acquaintance. The knowledge you have, not because someone told you, not because you reasoned your way to it, but because you have directly encountered the thing itself. The Gnostic use of the term carries all of that and adds something more. Because the object of gnosis in the Gnostic framework is not a fact about the world, it is the direct recognition of what you fundamentally are. Which means it is not a knowledge that exists between you and an external thing. It is the knowledge that arises when the knower and the known become, in a very precise sense, the same. The Gospel of Truth, a text associated with the Valentinian tradition, and likely written or transmitted by Valentinus himself around 150 CE, opens with a description of what it is like to live without gnosis. It calls the state agnosia, unknowing, and it describes it not as mere ignorance, but as a kind of active nightmare, consciousness, moving through a world that cannot satisfy it, grasping at things that dissolve on contact, unable to find the thing that would make it stop searching, because the thing it is searching for is the recognition of what it already is. This is not a moral failure. It is not sin in the Orthodox Christian sense. It is a condition, a cosmological condition produced by the fall, maintained by the archons, perpetuated by the counterfeiting spirit, and absolutely not permanent. The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text dated by scholars to approximately 250 CE, makes a distinction that cuts to the heart of the matter. It distinguishes between faith and knowledge, between hope and gnosis. Faith and hope are oriented towards something not yet possessed. You believe what you cannot see. You hope for what you do not yet have. Gnosis is oriented towards something already real, already present, momentarily obscured, but not absent. It is not the acquisition of something new. It is the recognition of something that was always there. This is why the Gnostic teachers consistently use the language of remembering rather than discovering. Anamnesis, unforgetting. The Platonic resonance is not coincidental. The Gnostic schools of the 2nd century were operating in a world saturated with Platonic and Neoplatonic thought, and they drew on that vocabulary deliberately. But they took the Platonic concept of recollection and charged it with something Plato did not supply, a cosmological account of why the forgetting happened in the first place, who benefits from its continuation, and what the practical mechanism of remembering looks like. For Plato, the soul forgot its prior knowledge when it entered a body, a natural, if regrettable, feature of embodiment. For the Gnostics, the forgetting was not natural, it was administered. The counterfeiting spirit, the archonic system, the haimarmene, these were active mechanisms of managed oblivion, not passive consequences of incarnation. The difference is significant. If the forgetting is natural, the remedy is philosophical practice. If the forgetting is administered, the remedy requires something that can penetrate the administration, something that comes from outside the system that is doing the forgetting. That something is what the Gnostic texts call the revealer, The figure who descends from the pleroma carrying the knowledge that the archons cannot intercept because it is not transmitted through the channels the archons control, not through tradition, not through institutional authority, through direct transmission, through what several texts call the living voice, the spoken teaching that carries pleroma resonance rather than archonic information. The Gospel of Thomas, 114 sayings attributed to Jesus and discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, with scholarly dating placing its core material as early as 50 to 100 CE, opens with this: "Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. Not whoever believes these sayings, not whoever obeys these sayings. Whoever finds the interpretation," meaning whoever achieves the direct understanding, the gnosis, of what is being pointed at. This is the operational core of the entire Gnostic project, not salvation through faith, not liberation through moral observance, recognition through direct knowing, the spark in you recognizing its own nature. 2. And in that recognition, the archonic system losing its hold, not because you have escaped the material world, but because you have seen through it, seen the bars for what they are. And in seeing the bars clearly, you are no longer fully inside the cell. Every Christian knows the story of Jesus, born in Bethlehem, virgin birth, crucified for your sins, rose on the third day. This is the story the Church has told for 2,000 years. But there is another story, the complete story. The version preserved in the Nag Hammadi texts, in the suppressed Gospels, in the teachings the 4th century Church declared heretical and spent considerable institutional energy attempting to eliminate. A version in which Jesus is not doing what the Orthodox account says he is doing, and in which the significance of his presence in the world is something categorically different from what you were taught. In the Gnostic account, Jesus is not primarily a sacrificial figure. He is a revealer. He descends from the pleroma not as a divine being who becomes human in the way the Nicene Creed defines it, but as a pleroma messenger who takes on the appearance of a human form specifically to operate within the archonic realm without being trapped by it. Several Gnostic schools held a position called Docetism, from the Greek word meaning to seem, which held that Jesus did not have a material body at all, or that the divine component of Jesus was distinct from the material body and departed before the crucifixion. The Apocalypse of Peter, a Nag Hammadi text, describes Jesus laughing above the cross while the material form is crucified below. The divine Christ and the earthly Jesus are not the same being in this account. They never were. This is not a peripheral Gnostic quirk. It is structurally required by the Gnostic cosmology. If matter is the product of a flawed creator and is itself a kind of cosmic mistake, then the highest divine being cannot be fully material. The incarnation, in the orthodox sense, is impossible in the Gnostic framework because it would mean the pleroma had entered the archonic realm on the archon's terms. What descends instead is something that wears materiality without being captured by it. A transmission inside a form, not a savior who dies for your sins, but an emissary who arrives with information the archons cannot suppress. The Apocryphon of John frames the entire text as a post-resurrection appearance of the divine Christ to John, the son of Zebedee. Not a bodily resurrection appearance, a visionary transmission. Jesus appears to John in a threefold form: child, old man, servant, and then reveals himself as the one who is with you always, the Spirit of truth, the Barbello, the Father, the Mother, the Son, a being that contains within itself the Trinitarian structure of the pleroma itself, and then proceeds to deliver the full cosmological account: the monad, the Barbello, the emanations, the fall of Sophia, the demiurge, the archons, the creation of the human body, the embedding of the divine spark. This is the content Jesus is transmitting in the Gnostic texts, not a moral code, not a path of virtue. A map of the cosmos and a description of what the human being is actually carrying inside it. The Gospel of Thomas is perhaps the most radical expression of this. It contains no birth narrative, no crucifixion, no resurrection in the conventional sense, no miracles as public demonstrations of divine power. It is 114 sayings, most of which are framed as riddles, designed not to be understood on the first reading but to work on the reader over time. Gnosis through contemplation rather than through narrative. The text operates on you rather than informing you. And the operating mechanism is precisely the divine spark. The sayings are calibrated, if that is the right word, to resonate with the pneuma rather than with the psyche or the soma. Logion 3 of the Gospel of Thomas is one of the most frequently cited passages in the entire Gnostic corpus, and it is worth sitting with in full. Jesus says, If those who lead you say to you, "See, the kingdom is in the sky," then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, "It is in the sea," then the fish will precede you. But the kingdom is inside you and outside you. Inside and outside, simultaneously. Not a location, a state of recognition. The kingdom is what you see when the veil lifts. When the divine spark identifies itself, when gnosis occurs. This is why the Gnostic Jesus is not a savior in the substitutionary sense. He does not absorb a debt you owe. He does not mediate between you and an angry God. The God he points toward is not angry. The God he points toward does not require mediation. The monad does not have preferences about human behavior. It does not reward or punish. It simply is, in the absolute fullness the texts try and fail and try again to describe. What Jesus does, in the Gnostic account, is remind. He is the living voice descending into the system of managed forgetting and speaking in a register that the counterfeiting spirit cannot process, that the archons cannot intercept, that the psychic layers cannot fully decode, but that the pneuma, the divine spark, buried in every person who is ready to hear it, recognizes immediately, not as new information, as something it always knew. This is where most treatments of Gnosticism stop. They give you the cosmology, the mythology, the cast of characters, the monad, Sophia, the demiurge, the archons, and then they leave you standing there with a map, but no road. They never tell you what the Gnostics actually did, how they practiced, what the rituals looked like, what they believed those rituals accomplished. Because the Gnostics had sacraments, they had initiatory practices, they had a structured path, and it looked almost nothing like what institutionalized Christianity turned its sacraments into. The Valentinian school, one of the most sophisticated and widely documented Gnostic traditions, active in the 2nd century CE, described 5 central sacramental rites. These are named and described across multiple sources, including Irenaeus of Lyons Against Heresies, written around 180 CE. Irenaeus was trying to refute Valentinianism, which means he had to document it accurately enough to argue against it. In doing so, he preserved details that the Gnostics' own texts, many of which were destroyed, might not have survived to tell us. The 5 rites were baptism, chrism, Eucharist, redemption, and the bridal chamber. 5 stages, 5 layers of initiation, each one corresponding to a deeper level of pneumatic awakening. Baptism you already know the word for, but in the Valentinian framework, baptism was not the washing away of sin. Sin, in the Gnostic cosmological scheme, is not really the operative category. What baptism washed away was ignorance. Specifically, the ignorance installed by the archonic system, the psychic fog, the false identity, the belief that the material self is the whole self. Water, in this context, was not purification from moral failure. It was the first gesture of remembering, the first formal acknowledgement that what you are is not what you have been told you are. Chrism, anointing with oil, carried a different weight. The word Christ itself derives from the Greek Christos, meaning anointed. In the Valentinian reading, to be anointed was not a metaphor for divine favor. It was a symbolic, and in some traditions, a literal enactment of the pneumatic identity being recognized. You are not being blessed from outside. You are being reminded of what was always inside. The oil touching the skin was the material world, acknowledging the light it contains. The Eucharist, in the Gnostic tradition, bore almost no resemblance to its institutional equivalent. Where the Orthodox tradition centered the Eucharist on sacrifice, the body and blood of Christ offered for the remission of sins, the Valentinian Eucharist was oriented toward gnosis itself, toward knowing. The act of eating and drinking together was a reenactment of participatory unity, not with a sacrificial God, but with the pleroma, the fullness from which all consciousness originates. Redemption, what the Valentinians called apollytrosis, is the most esoteric of the 5. It was a rite performed, in some accounts, by the dying or on behalf of the dying. The idea was that the pneuma, upon leaving the body, would pass through the archonic layers of the material cosmos. The archons would challenge it. They would demand it identify itself by the names they recognized, the names of the psychic self, the ego identity that the material system had constructed around it. The redemption rite gave the pneuma another set of responses, a counter-knowledge, a way of moving through the archonic checkpoints by refusing to be identified by them. The texts that describe this read less like religious liturgy and more like an escape protocol. And then, the bridal chamber. This is the one the Church Fathers found most disturbing, most incomprehensible, and most urgently in need of suppression. Because it was not about ethics. It was not about obedience. It was about reunion. The Gospel of Philip, a Valentinian text found at Nag Hammadi in 1945, a text scholars date to somewhere in the late 2nd or early 3rd century CE, describes the bridal chamber as the highest sacrament, not the last step of a sequence, but the transcendence of the sequence itself. It writes, and this is paraphrased closely from the text, "The bridal chamber is not for animals, nor for slaves, nor for defiled women. It is for free men and virgins." Free men, in this context, meaning those no longer owned by the archonic system. Virgins, meaning those whose pneuma has not been fully colonized by the false self. The bridal chamber was a ritual of union, not between two human beings, or not only that, between the pneumatic spark and its divine counterpart in the pleroma. The Gnostics called this counterpart the angel, your angel, the aspect of yourself that never descended, never fell, never forgot. The bridal chamber was where the descended fragment and the remaining fullness were symbolically, ritually, consciously rejoined. This is not psychology dressed in ancient language. This is a structured practice built on a coherent metaphysics of consciousness, one that the institutional church declared heretical, not because it was incoherent, but because it was self-sufficient. You did not need a priest. You did not need an institutional mediator. You needed gnosis. The Gospel of Philip sits inside the Nag Hammadi library like a compressed archive that was never meant to be easy. It does not read like a gospel in the sense most people are familiar with. It does not tell a story with a beginning and a middle and an end. It does not narrate the life of Jesus in any conventional sequence. What it does instead is present a series of meditations, sometimes short, sometimes extended, on the nature of names, the nature of truth, the nature of the sacraments, and the specific problem of what happens when you try to describe a spiritual reality using language that was designed to manage a material one. The text opens with a distinction that cuts everything that follows at a precise angle. It separates humanity into three categories. Hebrew, meaning those who belong to the earthly order; proselyte, meaning those who have been converted to the earthly order from outside it; and the free, meaning those who transcend the categorical framework entirely. This is not ethnic taxonomy. The Gnostics were not interested in ethnic taxonomy. This is a mapping of states of consciousness, states of orientation, states of relationship to the archonic system. The Gospel of Philip then does something that startled the scholars who first translated it out of Coptic in the decades after its 1945 discovery. It begins talking about names as a mechanism of control. Here is what the text argues. Names in the world are profoundly deceptive. When you name something, you do not reach its reality. You build a substitute for its reality. The name God does not touch what God is. The name Father does not describe the Father's actual nature. The name Holy Spirit does not capture what the Holy Spirit does. These names, in the archonic system, function as management tools. They give the lower world the impression of contact with the higher world while actually preventing that contact. You think you know God because you can say the word. The word is the archon's version of God, controllable, containable, mediated. This is not a modern philosophical observation. This is a 2nd century Gnostic text describing what contemporary cognitive science might call symbolic substitution, the process by which the representation of a thing comes to replace the thing itself in lived experience. The Gospel of Philip takes this further. It argues that the names used for the divine in the Hebrew tradition were not original names, they were translations, and in the translation, something was lost, not accidentally, but structurally. The Coptic text uses the specific word for error here. The archons do not know the true names. They could not know them. Their access to the pleroma is severed. So the language they have given the lower world is a world of errors, functional enough to manage the material system, not capable of pointing toward what lies beyond it. This is why the Gospel of Philip places such extraordinary weight on the sacrament of the bridal chamber, which we covered in the previous section. Because the bridal chamber is the one rite that operates beyond language. It does not require naming correctly. It requires being. The pneumatic self, in the moment of the bridal chamber, does not invoke the divine with words. It recognizes the divine with something that precedes words. The text calls this recognition by a term that translates imperfectly as knowing in fullness, a phrase that circles back to gnosis itself, to the direct apprehension that bypasses the archonic naming system. The text also addresses something that gets very little attention in popular treatments of Gnosticism. It addresses the question of why some people respond to this teaching and others do not. Why the same words land completely differently in different people. The Gospel of Philip's answer, because the pneuma recognizes what the psyche cannot. The psychic person, the person oriented primarily around the soul layer, the emotional and rational faculties, encounters Gnostic teaching and processes it the way they process everything else. Intellectually, comparatively, evaluatively, they might find it interesting, they might find it unsettling. They will generally return to the framework they already inhabit, because the psyche is the archon's most sophisticated instrument. It is smart enough to evaluate new information and old enough in its habits to find reasons to discard it. The pneumatic person encounters the same teaching and something else happens. Something below or behind the evaluative mind responds, not with analysis, with recognition. Viewer comments on earlier videos on this channel have gestured toward exactly this distinction. One viewer who had been working through the Nag Hammadi texts wrote, "This tied together a lot of loose ends I've been trying to overstand for a while." That phrase, overstand, not just understand, carries the whole Gnostic distinction in it. The psyche understands. It processes information from above. The pneuma overstands. It apprehends from a position that is already beyond the information being received. The Gospel of Philip is written for people who overstand. The rest of the world was not its intended audience, and the church knew it. There is a Greek word that sits at the absolute center of Gnostic practice, and almost never gets explained properly. The word is anamnesis. It is usually translated as remembrance or recollection, but that translation, while not wrong, is not right enough. Because remembrance implies that something was forgotten through ordinary forgetting. You put the keys down and forgot where. Anamnesis points at something structurally different. It points at forgetting that was installed, forgetting that is maintained. Forgetting that is the condition of your existence in this world, not an accident of your particular psychology. Anamnesis is unforgetting. The recovery, through direct experiential gnosis, of what you are, underneath everything the material system has layered over it. Plato used the same word, which is not a coincidence. In the Meno and the Phaedo, Plato argues that all genuine learning is actually recollection, that the soul already knows what it appears to be learning, and the process of education is one of drawing out what is already present, not depositing new information from outside. The Gnostics were aware of Plato. They engaged with Platonism extensively, and they found in his concept of anamnesis a framework that resonated with their own cosmological account of what happened to the pneuma when it descended into matter. But the Gnostic version of anamnesis is sharper, more urgent, more specifically located in a political and cosmic struggle. For Plato, forgetting was a natural consequence of embodiment. The soul drinks from the river Lethe as it descends and loses access to its prior knowledge, and the purpose of philosophy is to recover that access gradually through rigorous intellectual inquiry. This is a serene picture. It implies that the forgetting is unfortunate but neutral, and that the recovery is available to anyone willing to think carefully enough. The Gnostic account refuses the neutrality. The forgetting is not a natural consequence of embodiment. It is a feature of the system that the demiurge constructed and the archons maintain. The material world is specifically designed to prevent anamnesis. The psychic fog, the counterfeit spirit, is not the inevitable dimness of embodied consciousness. It is an active mechanism. It is the system working as intended. The world keeps you distracted not because distraction is native to matter, but because the architects of this world understood that a pneumatic person who achieved anamnesis would become ungovernable. This is the Gnostic claim that the Church found most dangerous. Not the cosmological complexity, not the multiple divine levels, not even the depiction of the God of the Hebrew Scriptures as a lesser, fallen being. Those could be argued against, condemned, declared heretical. What could not be easily managed was this: the teaching that the recovery of your true nature places you outside the jurisdiction of every institutional system that claims authority over you. A pneumatic person, in the full experience of anamnesis, does not need a church, does not need a priest, does not need a sacramental economy controlled by an institution. They have direct access. The Valentinians called this direct access gnosis. The Sethians called it the living water. The Gospel of Truth, which many scholars attribute to Valentinus himself, writing around 140 CE, describes it as waking from a dream, not a gentle waking, but the sudden, shocking clarity of someone who realizes that the entire landscape they were navigating was a projection of their own sleeping mind. The Gospel of Truth is worth spending time on here, because it approaches anamnesis differently from most of the other Nag Hammadi texts. Where the Apocryphon of John gives you the cosmological architecture, the cascade from the monad downward through the aeons, Sophia's fall, the demiurge's construction, the archons, the gospel of truth gives you the phenomenology. What it actually feels like from the inside. It describes error, the state of forgetting, as a kind of fog that settles over consciousness and produces terror. The person in error is terrified without knowing why. They are unstable without understanding the source of the instability. They grasp at things, relationships, achievements, ideologies, substances, structures, hoping that what they grasp will give them the solidity that the fog has taken from them. It never does. Because what they are missing is not something that exists in the material world to be found. It is something they already are, that the fog prevents them from recognizing. And then, gnosis arrives. The gospel of truth describes it as a word arriving from the pleroma, not a word in the ordinary sense, not language, but the logos, the living communication of what is real, descending through the archonic layers precisely because the archons cannot stop it from reaching the pneuma it is addressed to. When it arrives, the terror stops. Not because the material world changes. The material world does not change. The archons are still present. The structures of the false reality are still exactly where they were. What changes is orientation. The person who was lost inside the dream recognizes the dream as a dream. And that recognition, that single moment of seeing clearly, is anamnesis. It does not always come all at once. The Gnostics were careful about this. They did not promise a single lightning bolt conversion that resolved everything. What they described was more often a process, a deepening, a progressive unforgetting that the sacramental path was designed to support and sustain. The archons are not metaphors. This is the thing that modern interpreters of Gnosticism most consistently get wrong. They approach the archons as a colorful mythological representation of psychological forces, and in doing so, they diffuse the most radical thing about the Gnostic cosmological claim. The Gnostics were not proto-Jungians. They were not constructing an elaborate symbolic vocabulary for what we would now call the ego, the shadow, the complex. They believed the archons were real, operative, present as actual structuring forces in the world that a human being navigates. Now, can a modern person engage with the archon teaching productively through a psychological lens? Yes. There is genuine insight available there, and we will get to that. But first, the claim needs to be stated as the Gnostics actually made it. Because softening it into metaphor before you understand it as a literal claim is how you miss the force of what it is pointing toward. In the Apocryphon of John, arguably the most systematic cosmological document in the Nag Hammadi library, a text that scholars date to the late 1st or early 2nd century CE, the archons are described in technical detail. There are 7 of them, corresponding to the 7 planetary spheres of ancient cosmology. Each one rules over a specific domain of the material world. Each one is named. The names vary across manuscripts, but the core list persists. One archon governs what the texts call goodness in a false register, a simulation of goodness that masks control. One governs providence, in the same false mode. One governs divinity. One governs lordship. One governs jealousy, and this is the one most directly associated with the God of the Hebrew Scriptures, the one who declares, "I am a jealous God." One governs understanding, again, a simulation, a managed version of understanding that keeps inquiry within the system's acceptable parameters. And one governs wisdom, the counterfeit of the Sophia, the texts describe as the origin of the entire problem. 7 archons, 7 layers, 7 modes of managed reality. You are born into a world organized by these 7 forces, and from the moment of your first breath, the counterfeit spirit, the false self that the Apocryphon of John describes as the archon's primary installation mechanism, begins doing its work. What is the counterfeit spirit installing? The belief that the material psychic self is the whole self. The belief that your name, your history, your desires, your fears, your social role, your biological drives, that all of this is what you are, rather than what the archonic system has built around what you are. The counterfeit spirit is not evil in the melodramatic sense. It does not experience itself as a deceiver. It is simply the operating system of the lower world, running continuously, maintaining the conditions under which the lower world functions. This is where the psychological reading becomes useful, not as a replacement for the literal reading, but as an extension of it. Because if you ask what, in contemporary terms, functions the way the archons function, what organizes human experience in a way that systematically prevents self-knowledge, that maintains stable structures of distraction and false identification, that punishes deviation from the consensus reality, the answer is not hard to find. Every social institution that requires your identification with a role rather than with your actual nature is doing archonic work. Every economic structure that keeps you oriented toward survival and accumulation rather than toward inquiry and recognition is running the archonic program. Every ideological system that tells you the questions you are asking are dangerous, inappropriate, heretical, that is an archon speaking. Not a supernatural being necessarily, a structural force, a pattern of organized power that has, as its primary function, the maintenance of the forgetting. The Gnostics understood this with a sophistication that their 2,000-year-old texts should not, by any conventional measure, possess. The Testimony of Truth, a Sethian text found at Nag Hammadi, that scholars date to somewhere in the late 2nd century CE, explicitly names religious institutions among the archonic forces, not just pagan religion, not just the emperor cult. Jewish law and Christian orthodoxy are both, in the Testimony of Truth's reading, systems operating in the service of the demiurge's world, systems that point toward the divine, while structurally preventing contact with it. This is the move that made the Gnostics ungovernable. They did not simply propose a different theology. They proposed a different ontology, a different account of what is actually happening, that placed every power structure that claimed authority over the human person inside the problem rather than inside the solution. The archons cannot be bargained with. They cannot be appeased. They are not waiting to be persuaded by correct doctrine or good behavior or sufficient penance. They are the condition of the forgetting. The only move that defeats them is the one they are designed to prevent. The pneumatic person waking up to what they actually are, achieving anamnesis, and recognizing that the authority the archons exercise was never real. It was always, and only, the authority of a dream over a dreamer who had not yet understood they were dreaming. So let's talk about what that waking actually looks like in practice. Because the Gnostic texts are not purely abstract. They are not content to describe the prison and then leave you sitting in it with better vocabulary. The whole architecture of Gnostic teaching, the cosmology, the mythology, the classification of human types, points toward a specific outcome. And that outcome is not belief. It is not conversion. It is not the adoption of a new set of doctrines to replace the old ones. The outcome is anamnesis, unforgetting. The recovery of what was always there underneath the conditioning, underneath the forgetting, underneath the weight of the material world pressing down on the spark you carry. And this is where the teaching gets practical, in a way that surprises most people who encounter Gnostic thought only through its cosmological framework. The Valentinian school, the tradition associated with Valentinus and his students, operating primarily in the 2nd century CE, developed what amounted to a structured approach to awakening. It was not a casual process. It was not the result of simply hearing the right information and mentally agreeing with it. The Valentinians were explicit that gnosis could not be transmitted like a fact. You could not hand someone gnosis the way you hand someone a map. What you could do was create the conditions in which the pneuma, the divine spark already present in the person, could recognize itself. That recognition is the whole game. Everything else, the texts, the teachings, the mythology of Sophia, and the demiurge and the archons, exists to serve that single moment of recognition. And the Valentinians had a word for what happens in that moment. They called it apolytrosis, liberation. Not liberation as a future event that happens after death, if you followed the rules. Liberation as a present tense experience available to the pneumatic person right now, in this body, in this life. The Gospel of Truth, a Valentinian text discovered at Nag Hammadi and dated by scholars to the mid-2nd century CE, describes the experience of awakening with language that is almost impossible to read without recognizing something. The text says, and this is a direct paraphrase of the core passage, that the pneumatic person exists in the material world, the way a person exists in a dream. They see terrifying things. They run from pursuers. They strike out at enemies. They receive blows. They fall from heights. All of it is vivid. All of it feels absolutely real. And then they wake up. And the text says, they leave nothing behind when they wake up, because there was nothing there. The dream was never real. This is not comfort. This is not pastoral reassurance that everything will be fine eventually. This is a cosmological claim. The material world and everything that happens in it has the ontological status of a dream, not a metaphor for a dream. Structurally, actually, the same kind of thing. The archons are dream figures. The suffering is dream suffering. The death you fear is a dream death that happens to a dream body inhabited temporarily by something that cannot die. And the Valentinian practice was oriented entirely around waking the person up to this reality before the body died, not after. Now, the specific practices varied across different Gnostic communities and different periods. The Sethian text, the tradition associated with the figure of Seth, Adam's third son, who in Gnostic mythology carries the divine seed forward, describe practices of ascent. Visionary practices in which the practitioner, through specific forms of contemplation and ritualized intention, moves consciousness upward through the archontic levels, passing through each sphere, naming the archons, refusing their authority, ascending toward the pleroma. The text called Zostrianos, found at Nag Hammadi, describes such an ascent in detail. It is not casual reading. It is a technical document for practitioners who understood the framework and were attempting to move within it. The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, approaches the same territory through the lens of ritual and sacrament, but reframes sacrament completely. Where the Orthodox Church uses sacrament to bind the believer to institutional authority, the Gospel of Philip presents sacramental experience as a direct encounter with the divine that requires no intermediary and grants no power to any institutional structure. The bridal chamber, a central image in the Gospel of Philip, is not a ceremony administered by priests. It is a description of the union of the pneuma with its divine origin, the moment of recognition that the spark and the pleroma are not separate, have never been separate, and that the apparent separation was always the condition of the dream. This is where the waking happens, not in doctrine. In direct experience of what you actually are, there is a question that never quite gets asked directly in academic treatments of Gnosticism, but it is the question underneath every other question anyone actually brings to this material. And the question is, what does it feel like? Not what does it mean cosmologically, not what did the second-century practitioners believe. What is the actual phenomenology of the experience the texts are pointing at? What happens in a person when the anamnesis occurs? The texts describe it from multiple angles, and what is striking is how consistent the descriptions are across traditions that had no direct contact with one another. The Gospel of Truth uses the image of waking from a nightmare. One moment, everything is vivid and terrifying and absolutely real. The next moment, none of it is anywhere. Not diminished, not faded, simply gone, because it was never there in the way a real thing is there. The person who wakes is not changed by the waking. The person who wakes discovers what they already were before the dream began. The Apocryphon of John describes the recognition moment differently, as a sudden knowing, not a gradual accumulation of evidence leading to a conclusion. A sudden knowing, the kind that does not arrive through the reasoning process but simply is there, the way you know your own name when you hear it spoken. The text frames this as the pneuma recognizing the voice of the divine, a voice that has always been speaking, inside the person. At a frequency, the material world is specifically designed to drown out. The Thomas tradition, the Gospel of Thomas, which opens with the claim that these are the secret sayings of the living Jesus, and which scholars date to somewhere between 50 and 140 CE, depending on the layer of the text, presents the recognition as a discovery that was hiding in plain sight. Saying 3 of the Gospel of Thomas says, "If those who lead you say to you, 'Look, the kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds will arrive there before you. If they say it is in the sea, then the fish will arrive there before you. But the kingdom is inside you, and it is outside you. When you come to know yourselves, you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father." This is not a description of a distant salvation. This is a description of something available now, here, in the moment of recognition. The kingdom is not a place you go. It is what you already are when the forgetting lifts. Now, I want to be honest about something here, because this is a place where the material demands honesty. I have spent years with these texts, and I have had moments, not while reading, not while thinking, but in the particular quality of silence that sometimes follows extended engagement with this material where something shifted, where the ordinary sense of being a person inside a world briefly gave way to something that I can only describe as the world being inside awareness rather than awareness being inside the world. It does not last. The material conditions reassert themselves. The archontic weight returns. But the moment leaves something, not a belief, not a conviction that can be argued for or against. A memory, and the Gnostic term for that memory is exactly right. Anamnesis, unforgetting. You do not learn something new, you remember something ancient. I am not claiming this as evidence for the literal truth of Gnostic cosmology. I am describing a phenomenological reality that the texts map with unusual precision. Whatever the underlying metaphysics, the experience the texts are describing is real. People have it. They have been having it for as long as there have been people capable of reflecting on their own existence. What the Gnostic framework does, what makes it uniquely valuable among all the frameworks that attempt to account for this experience, is that it takes the experience seriously as primary data, rather than explaining it away. Orthodox religion explains it away. You feel alienated from the world? That's sin. You sense something beyond the material? Pray harder and obey the church. You experience a moment of recognition that you are something other than what the social order tells you you are. That is pride. That is heresy. Get back in line. The Gnostic tradition says, yes, what you felt was real. Here is what it was. Here is the map that shows where you are and what you are, and why the recognition feels like coming home rather than arriving somewhere new, because it is coming home. The pneuma recognizing itself is not a foreign experience being imported into you from outside. It is the deepest thing you are, remembering itself through you right now. Here is the thing that should not be possible given the scale and thoroughness of the suppression campaign waged against Gnostic thought. It survived, not in fragments, not as a historical curiosity preserved in the footnotes of hostile sources. It survived as a living current, one that reappears, in recognizable form, in tradition after tradition, century after century, in places and among people who often had no direct access to the original Nag Hammadi texts, and no institutional connection to any named Gnostic school. This fact alone tells you something about what Gnosticism actually is. If it was simply a set of doctrines, suppression would have worked. Doctrines can be burned. Libraries can be destroyed. Teachers can be executed. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE began the formal institutional process of defining orthodoxy in a way that specifically excluded Gnostic teachings. Theodosius, I made heresy a criminal offense against the Roman state in 380 CE. The penalty for possessing certain Gnostic texts was death. By the 5th century, the organized Gnostic schools of Alexandria and Rome had been systematically dismantled. And yet, in the 7th century, a movement called the Paulicians emerged in the Armenian highlands, teaching a dualist cosmology, a good spiritual God opposed to a lesser evil creator of the material world that is structurally identical to Gnostic teaching. They had no surviving Gnostic libraries. They were not, as far as historians can determine, in continuity with the 2nd century Alexandrian schools. But the insight they arrived at was the same insight. Because the insight does not require a library, it arises from the same encounter with experience that the original Gnostic teachers documented. In the 10th and 11th centuries, the Bogomils in the Balkans taught the same essential framework to the material world as the creation of a lesser being, the human person as a divine spark trapped in matter, liberation through direct knowledge rather than institutional mediation. They were declared heretics. They were persecuted. They survived and spread. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the Cathars of southern France built an entire regional civilization, one of the most sophisticated in medieval Europe, on a foundation that was, at its core, Gnostic. The material world as the product of a false creator, the human soul as a trapped divine particle seeking liberation. The Church as an archontic institution whose primary function was to prevent that liberation by maintaining the forgetting. The Cathars were not fringe figures. They had the support of the nobility of Languedoc. They had hospitals, schools, public institutions. They practiced a form of Christianity that was, in many ways, more ethically rigorous than anything Rome was offering at the time. Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade against them in 1209. It was not a military campaign with prisoners and negotiations and treaties. It was a program of extermination. The legate, Arnaud Amalric, asked by the Crusaders how to distinguish Cathars from Catholics in the city of Béziers, allegedly said, "Kill them all. God will know his own." 20,000 people were killed in a single afternoon. By 1244, the last Cathar stronghold at Montségur had fallen. The perfect, the Cathar equivalent of the initiated pneumatics, walked into the flames rather than recant. The institution that burned them is still operating. The teaching they died for reappeared, in different forms, in different centuries, again and again. It reappeared in the mystical traditions within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, in Kabbalah, in certain strands of Christian mysticism, in Sufism, all of which, when examined carefully, contain structural elements that are recognizably Gnostic. a hidden divine reality behind the manifest world, a human soul with a divine origin, a path of direct interior knowledge as distinct from externally administered salvation. It reappeared in the Western esoteric tradition in figures like Paracelsus, Jacob Boehme, Emanuel Swedenborg, who arrived at cosmological frameworks strikingly similar to Gnostic teaching without, in most cases, direct access to the Gnostic texts themselves. And it reappeared in 1945, literally buried in the ground, waiting. The Nag Hammadi discovery was not accidental in the way that purely random events are accidental. A man named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging near the base of a cliff in Upper Egypt. His mattock struck a sealed ceramic jar. Inside the jar were 13 leather-bound codices containing 52 texts in Coptic translation from Greek originals. The texts had been buried almost certainly by monks from the nearby Pachomian monastery sometime around 367 CE, shortly after the Bishop of Alexandria issued a directive ordering the destruction of unauthorized texts. Someone buried them to save them. They waited 16 centuries to be found. That is not metaphor. That is documented history. Someone died knowing those texts might never be read again, and they were read again. 78 years ago, and now, and in every reading that follows, because what those texts describe cannot be permanently suppressed. It keeps returning, not because of institutional continuity, because the experience it maps keeps happening to people. And those people keep needing language for what they encountered. And when they find the Gnostic language, they recognize it, not as new information, as a description of something they already knew. We have covered an enormous amount of ground. Let's hold it all for a moment before we close. We began with the architecture of the pleroma, the fullness that existed before the material world, before the demiurge, before any of this. The divine realm not as a place you go after you die, but as the actual ontological foundation of what you are. We moved through the emanation, how the aeons emerge from the monad, not as separate creations, but as expressions of an infinite consciousness, exploring its own nature. We arrived at Sophia, at her fall, at the accident that produced the material world, and we were precise about what kind of accident it was. Not a moral failure, not a punishment, a consequence of attempting to know the unknowable without the proper relational context. Something that could only happen because the capacity for such a fall was already implicit in the fullness itself. We looked at the demiurge not as an evil being in any simple sense, but as a being of profound limitation, operating under a catastrophic misapprehension. He believes he is the only God, because he cannot perceive what is above him. And from that belief, the entire architecture of the material world with its hierarchies, its authorities, its structures designed to maintain ignorance and obedience, follows with a kind of terrible logic. We looked at the archons and what they actually are, not demons in the medieval horror movie sense, structural forces, the tendencies within material existence that keep consciousness oriented toward the surface, toward the temporary, toward the forgetting. Time is an archon. Death is an archon. The social order that tells you what you are and what your limits are, archon. The internal voice that says you are only a body, only a collection of biological processes, only what you can see and measure and prove, archon. We looked at the three anthropological types, the hylic, the psychic, the pneumatic, and we were honest about what that framework is and is not. It is not a ranking system. It is not a reason for spiritual pride. It is a description of different orientations toward the material world, different degrees of connection to the divine spark, different capacities for anamnesis. And we were honest that the categories are not fixed. The pneumatic person does not succeed because they are better. They succeed because something in them was already pointing toward the exit before they knew there was a door. We looked at how the waking actually happens through the Valentinian practices of recognition and apollitrosis, through the Sethian ascent practices, through the Gospel of Thomas tradition of interior discovery, through the Gospel of Philip's vision of the bridal chamber as union with the divine source, not through anamnesis. And we looked at the legacy at the Paulicians and the Bogomils and the Cathars, at the burning of Béziers, at the texts buried in a jar near a cliff in Upper Egypt, waiting 16 centuries to be found. Because what is true cannot be permanently destroyed. It can be suppressed. It can be driven underground. It can be forced to change its language and its institutional form. But the experience it maps keeps happening, and the people it happens to keep finding their way back to this material. If you are one of those people, and if you have stayed with this for the full length of this video, you almost certainly are, then I want to leave you with something specific rather than something vague. The Gnostic tradition does not ask you to believe anything on faith. It does not ask you to join an institution, or accept an authority, or perform a ritual submission to a hierarchy. What it asks is simpler and harder than any of those things. It asks you to look directly at your own experience, the alienation you have always felt, the sense that something is wrong with the world that goes deeper than any political or social explanation can account for, the moments of recognition that arrive without warning and leave something behind, and to take that experience seriously as primary data about what you actually are. You are not a body that accidentally developed consciousness. You are not a biological accident in an indifferent universe. You are not what the demiurge's world says you are. The pneuma inside you is older than this world. It is not from here. It came from somewhere else, and some part of you has always known that, and that knowledge is not pathology, and it is not delusion. It is the oldest and most reliable thing about you. One viewer who commented on our previous video about the pleroma, the full story we covered in detail in that video, wrote something that I haven't been able to stop thinking about since I read it. They said, "This tied together a lot of loose ends I've been trying to overstand for a while." Overstand, not understand. Overstand. And I think that is exactly the right word for what Gnosticism offers. Not a comprehension that places you below the material looking up at it trying to make sense of it. A comprehension that places you above it, or more precisely, a recognition that you are always above it, always outside it, always the dreamer rather than the dream. That is what the texts have been saying for 2,000 years. That is what was buried in a jar in Egypt and found by a man with a mattock in 1945. That is what was worth dying for at Montségur in 1244. That is what the archons are specifically, structurally, constitutionally designed to prevent you from knowing. And now you know it. What you do with it, that is yours.